Hey everyone, how you going? Welcome to our YouTube channel. Grain and Grape is a homebrew shop that is committed to helping you brew better beer. So if that sounds like it might be at all useful to you, consider subscribing. My name's Joel. Next to me here is Ben.
G'day.
So firstly, I guess thank you for taking a bit of time out from your doom scrolling to watch our show. It's 2021.
Yeah, that means everything's good now,
everything's better. Everything's magically better now. Yeah, maybe not, but
no, absolutely. Yeah, that's how these things work.
Yeah.
We set some arbitrary dates at some point in our distant past, and now we're into the new number.
Yeah,
it's all going to be
everything's forgotten. Yeah. Everything's better. Well, we hope that you're doing well out there in your own way, wherever you are. Yeah, hopefully we can distract you for an hour or so with some brewing.
Give you some vital skills for the coming apocalypse.
Yep. Brewers will be in demand, so that's what we're here to help with.
Yeah.
So Ben.
Yes.
Yeah. You know how to brew.
I do. I've done it a few times.
That's helpful because today you're going to be showing us how to brew a type of IPA. I'll let you maybe explain a bit more about what that type of IPA is.
Yeah, definitely. So I think in the last probably 5 years, we've seen a massive shift towards the really fruity, hazy, kind of creamy East Coast New England style IPAs. And if anybody's sort of been following these streams for a while, they know that I'm definitely a big fan of those. But before the kind of your heady toppers and things took center stage, I think the classic American IPA really was a dry, clear, clean, crisp, and super bitter beer, which is considerably different to the kind of the fruity, hazy things that we see today. So I guess I've been missing them.
Yeah.
I think a few people have. Folks that have sort of been around the traps for a while and used to go to the craft beer bars back in the day when every second tap was a 300 IBU punch to the face.
I do remember the IBU arms race for a while there. It was all about
like professional chili eating
version.
But for beer. Yeah. So I don't know. I kind of thought, well, let's have a look at them because it's one of those styles you can do a really serviceable version relatively easily, but to really nail it and get an awesome version, it takes a little bit more kind of skill and finesse. So we're going to be hopefully doing the second one of those two things today, but basically kind of looking at a few different strategies and ways to achieve a good one. Hopefully, fingers crossed. Yeah. We'll see at the end. Hopefully, so my plan with this one is that we'll ferment it here and kind of try to will a return to the wall of beer.
Yeah, well, it's been a while.
Sort of manifest it through, I don't know, wishful thinking, I guess.
Well, we almost sort of got there for a while. There was a few weeks of mask-free respite.
Those bloody tennis players. Every year I'm like, we need to stop having the Australian Open in Melbourne, and now I've been proven right. We should. I've been saying it for the last 15 years, and now the city becomes a nightmare all the tourists everywhere.
But oh well, of course, you know, we complain, but everyone's doing their bit by wearing the masks.
Yeah.
But it was nice to not have to wear them for a short while.
Yeah, it was a blissful few weeks.
Yeah. Well, maybe that'll be a teaser. If we ever get to 5,000 subscribers, we'll reveal our faces. You'll get to see what we look like, local laws permitting. So yeah, now what was I going to say? Bit of business in the chat. If anyone has any questions, feel free to ask them in the chat.
Or suggestions.
Or if you want to answer corrections or answer questions as well. For those of you who may be a bit more experienced out there, if you see someone ask a question in the chat, feel free to answer. I will do my best to pass the questions on to Ben as he runs the demo, but we probably won't get onto all the questions. So don't fear if we can't do that. Just maybe someone else out there will be able to help you out. So I'm going to jump behind the camera and run things from there, and Ben will take over.
Start talking a lot.
And start talking a lot. Yeah, cool.
Cool, so let's get going, I reckon. I've just had this running on, we're doing a Brewmeister today, just because they're super easy to use and fun. But we need to get the brewing salts in there so that we can get that mixed in and ready for when the grains go in, which is going to be in the next probably 5 or 10 minutes. So let's get these salts dissolved. You don't have to dissolve your salts first, but I always do. I just find it mixes a little bit better in. Sort of. I always kind of hear the little clink, clink, clink as the calcium chloride hits the bottom of the kettle, and it's like, oh, is that going to properly dissolve? Whereas if you dissolve it first, you know, get that mixed in. Doesn't have to be any fancy way of doing it. Got my little paddle. I'll just give that a little mix around. Because of the nature of how the Brewmeister works as well, you've got a malt pipe in the middle, which is sealed on the bottom. So I'm just going to lift the malt pipe to let the water kind of equalize. And then that way it'll just be mixed in the stuff on the side as well, not just the stuff inside the malt pipe. And then we're good for the grains. So what I'll do, I'll duck down and I'll get out of the manual mode and get into a recipe mode.
For anyone interested, the back of Ben's head is brought to you by Brewmeister.
Yeah. Cool. So, obviously not everyone's going to have a Brewmeister. They are, we kind of describe them as sort of like the Rolls Royce of homebrew systems. I don't know if that's necessarily true, because I think they're much more value for money than a Rolls Royce. I think there's a certain point where you're paying for the prestige more than the actual functionality, and I feel like the Brewmeisters really do deliver on the functionality. But what we'll be doing today, you can do on literally any system that you've got. It's just a matter of changing the specific mechanics of the brewing process to suit whatever system you're using. There's a lot of single vessel systems on the market now, and I feel like a lot of home brewers are using something like that these days. So most of the things will be kind of a pretty good one-to-one crossover. But if you are kind of in an old-fashioned sort of 3-vessel system with a mash slaughter tun, separate kettle, and HLT. Just change things around a little bit. Yeah. Use a little bit less water in the mash, sparge with your sparge water, and then once it gets to the kettle, it's all going to be the same thing from there. And if I sort of get to any point where I feel like there is going to be a little bit of difference, I'll mention that as well. So sort of like if you're brewing on this, you might do this slightly differently in this way, sort of thing. But yeah, basically, regardless of what system you're using, the chemical outcomes are the same, and the things that you're trying to achieve are pretty much the same as well. So,
and speaking of chemicals, I presume you're going to be covering this as you get to it, but we had a question about salts, the salts you're using.
Yeah, and that's a pretty important question when it comes to West Coast IPAs as well. Because you really do want it to have a sharp, assertive bitterness, a West Coast IPA. And one of the many ways that you can achieve this, you can almost kind of just apply the exact opposite advice that I gave on the NEPA to the West Coast. You want to have a high sulfite to chloride ratio in your water, because your sulfite's going to give you that sort of sharpness and that definition of your hops. The chloride sort of softens things a little bit. It does bring up the richness and like those sorts of flavors, so it's good to have a little bit in your water, but you definitely want to outweigh the chloride with the sulfate by a bit. And I mean, that's going to vary depending on your water source. Our water here, Altona water, is quite chloride heavy.
Oh.
So I've had to compensate for that with my salt additions as well. So I've got about 7 or 8 grams of, I can't remember exactly what it was. It was about 7 or 8 grams of calcium sulfate and sort of 1.5 to 2 grams of calcium chloride have gone in there.
So more gypsum than calcium chloride is basically the aim, is the general gist for a classic West Coast IPA.
Yeah, you just get that sharpness and that definition and that kind of punch of the bitterness. Like you want to feel the bitterness on a West Coast IPA. You want it to be almost a challenge, at least at first. I mean, over time you kind of develop, I mean, I mentioned chili eating before. It really is sort of a pretty close comparison because over time you get a tolerance for bitterness. You get a lot better at dealing with it, and much like chilies, as that tolerance grows, the bitterness kind of gives way for the amazing flavors of the hops that you're using. And a lot of times the only way you can achieve some of those flavors is by using that many of those hops in that way. So you kind of, by going through the initial pain of developing your bitterness tolerance, you're opening up a whole world of flavors that you wouldn't be able to enjoy and appreciate otherwise. So I think it's worth it. Yeah,
and that could be said for a lot of things in brewing. In beer, sourness as well is an analogy perhaps of building up your tolerance for sour beers and things like that. So
I think even just beer in general. I remember as a kid, you know, like the first probably 20 or 30 beers I drank I thought were disgusting. And I mean, to be fair, they probably were, but you know, you sort of had to build up an appreciation of the flavour of beer. For me, it was an economic kind of motivation where if I went to the pub, beers were a lot cheaper than other drinks, so I couldn't afford to drink anything else, so I had to learn to like beer, which is kind of crazy to think about now because it's all I think about is drinking beer these days. So, well, not all I think about, but when I'm thinking about drinking something, that's usually what kind of springs to mind as the optimal choice.
Well, I hope that answered your question, Maya. I hope that's pronouncing your name right. I know that this is on top of all the other things you have to do around the shop. It's always a challenge, but you'll be posting the recipe, or we'll be trying to get the recipe up.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I can even give you this sheet if you want, and
I'll take a photo, and that'll have the salts. Do you have the salts on there? Okay, good.
Yep. Okay. And the salts will change depending on where you're brewing and what your water is. I kind of, because it's the first demo of the year, I'm going to try to keep this pretty entry level. Still, like, obviously have some good nuggets. Nuggets are hot. Hopefully have some good nuggets of kind of IPA specific wisdom in there as well. Because as you all know, I'm a very wise IPA brewer. But I will be sort of keeping it fairly approachable and maybe going over some things that I've mentioned before. But,
that's fine, yeah.
But if you are in Melbourne, depending on which suburb you live in and your water provider, City West Water has a full suburb by suburb breakdown of all the water, as it's on there as like the water quality report.
Yep.
And you can get really good information about your local water from that and use that as your starting point for your recipes.
Yeah, find your local water provider, and if you can do a search. Sometimes they'll put them on their websites. The water quality report is often the thing you've got to look for. Not all water suppliers are equal, though. I know Yarra Valley Water, for example, don't have very up to date. It's a maze.
It can be a bit of a process.
So you just
asking them for that information as well. So I think one of the best things you can do is join a homebrew club.
Yeah.
Because somebody has gone through that pain and that torture at some point in the past and managed to acquire the secret knowledge, and I'm more than happy to share them with other members within those clubs. Plus, you know, you're getting access to a whole bunch of different brewers with different knowledge and experience and skill sets And generally when you get a bunch of people with different skill sets together in pursuit of a common goal, you tend to achieve that goal a lot quicker. I'm going to pour this grain into the water before I lose too much temperature. So hopefully it all fits. Another running theme in a lot of my demos, particularly with the Brewmaster, is I like to push the limitations of the hardware. And this is probably a little bit more grain than the unit is designed to take. See you, Matty.
Just a little bit of behind the scenes business there. Oscar is on his way in.
Ah, excellent.
Everybody, yay. That doesn't mean anything for you watching at home.
Means something to me. All right, so if you're brewing with a friend, which I recommend, not all the time, but sometimes, it can be a really fun day. But this might be a point at which you hand them a paddle, and as you're pouring it in there, get them to agitate it and break it up as it hits the water. And that kind of helps to prevent the formation of dough balls. Another tactic which I normally employ is I'll pour a little bit in, stir it around, pour a little bit more in, stir it around. I didn't do either of those things today because as yet on stream we've not encountered a dough ball. So let's see if we get one today.
And dough balls, of course, are clumps of grain that they just sort of form. The water doesn't penetrate all the way through, and it can hurt the efficiency of your mash.
Yeah, among other things.
Among other things.
I don't know what those other things would be. But yeah, if the little enzymes don't get access to all of the delicious starch, then neither do the yeast. So we want to make sure that there's no big clumps of grain, because when the grain gets crushed, it produces sort of like a bit of a flour with a bunch of husks, and that flour can kind of set in the water and form like a skin around a clump of your grain. So that's what we're trying to avoid. And it's always more challenging when you've got a really full mash to check for it. But again, it's what I like to do. I don't like to make it easy for myself. And I'm going to keep trying to talk while I'm doing this because it's not the most compelling viewing when I'm just standing there poking.
Well, actually, I've got something for you to fill the air with.
Oh,
we do have a question about rainwater, I guess, relating to salts and how you treat it. This is a question that comes up every now and then, so it doesn't hurt to sort of...
It is, and it's not one that has an easy answer.
Yes, yeah, like many things in brewing.
There are a bunch of variables at play. So rainwater itself, in theory, should be relatively pure.
Yeah.
But the reality is, as it's falling, it picks up particles from the air, usually lands on some kind of roof. The roof is made out of a certain type of material, runs down gutters, picks up things in the gutters, and it ends up in a big tank. And then the tank is also usually made out of some kind of material. So all of those things are going to impart different stuff to the water. If you've got like a concrete tank, there's a fair chance you're going to get a fair bit of calcium into your water. And depending on sort of, again, the tank itself, it might make it quite carbonate as well, which means that it can have quite a strong alkaline buffer, and that can involve a little bit of work to get your water back to an easily usable state.
Okay, so there are pH factors.
Like a pH buffer, yeah. It's going to sort of make it a little bit harder to pull your pH down. That said, that's not always the case. Plastic tanks are probably less likely to do that. But yeah, there's no easy answer, I guess, to the question.
I think. No, so I guess the hard part of it is you don't know what the baseline is. It's hard to know what's in the tank. So when designing your salt profile or your mineral profile in your beer, it's hard to do that because you don't know what the starting point is. So I've heard it suggested that you can get your water tested at pool shops.
I've also heard that, and
I don't know how that works. I don't know what analysis they're able to offer beyond if it's just a simple pH reading, or if they can actually tell you what the mineral content of the water is. That sounds pretty.
I've not actually done it, but I have heard of people saying that they've done it and that it's given them what they needed and done the job.
So that might be something to consider. Again, something I've heard of but not ever done. You can send your water off to labs for usually they're testing it for safety and things like that. But I'd imagine, give you a pretty detailed analysis. I think Google will probably be your friend there. But yeah, unfortunately, otherwise, or you could just wing it, I guess, is the other.
And I think that's what a lot of people end up doing.
Just wing it and brew a few beers and see what turns out and make adjustments every
And you'll
batch
kind of get an idea. Like, there's certain things you can do which will give you kind of an idea. I guess it's tricky training your palate up to the point where you can make that sort of estimation. But if you get to know what chloride, sulfate, those sorts of things impart into a beer through their presence in the water, you can sort of brew a few simple beers and kind of try to estimate. And it's not as an easy thing as I'm making it out to be, but if you sort of are finding that your beers are generally turning out not quite as sharp or defined as you want them to, based on your salt additions, then you can boost up your sulfate and kind of try to figure out a good kind of calibration for the way that you're adding salts to your water to get them to where you need to be. And if you've got a bunch of kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? House recipes, I guess.
Yep.
Over time, you'll kind of know from experience roughly what kind of salt additions you'll make to make that beer taste the way that you want it to. And over time, the more you do that, the more you're going to get an intuitive kind of feel for what you're doing as well.
Brew the same recipe over a period of time and make small adjustments, perhaps. David is positing would reverse osmosis be a good approach to rainwater? I mean,
it really would.
Yeah, that way
you know exactly what you're starting with. It's not the cheapest setup, although I think it's getting better than it has been in the past.
I'm not too familiar with her. Yeah.
But a lot of American homebrewers end up sort of by necessity going down that path because the groundwater in a lot of America is super hard and super carbonate.
Yep.
And it's almost impossible to brew with unless you're just brewing nothing but stouts and porters. So
yep.
I think it's really common in American home brewing to get a reverse osmosis filter just to reset your water to zero and then build your profile from scratch. Yeah, so that's something worth considering as well. You can even distill the water if you wanted to. That's another one.
Oh, okay. Yeah,
we do sell stills.
Yeah.
But I mean, it's pretty simple. You just need something to boil a bunch of water, something to cool it, and something to collect it. So cool the steam, I mean.
Yep.
Turn it back into water, and that distillation process will remove any kind of metals and
impurities
things from the water. And then again, you'll be starting from a neutral starting point, which you can then add what you need. It's a process though.
Yeah, distilled water, of course.
A decent process.
Yes, yeah, sure, yeah. Yep.
I think a lot of brewers these days at least have a chlorine filter, just in line from their brewing tap, which is a pretty easy thing to set up.
Yep.
We sell them here. and I think you can get reverse osmosis filters similarly easy to set up. Just kind of fix them to the tap that you're going to be using for your brewing and do it that way. These cubes that we use for no chill, you could, if you didn't have it, if you weren't able to set up the filter near where you're going to be brewing, you can just fill a bunch of these, run them down to your brewing space, and then pour them into your mash tuns, kettles, etc. As well. There's options. Yeah, there's definitely options. But yeah, like a lot of people, me and Joel recently had a brew day out on a mate's farm, and they've adopted the figure out what your water's like and kind of go from there.
Yeah, okay.
Approach. And the beers that I make out there always come out really good, so it works.
And we both got terribly sunburned.
Oh yes.
Which is to call out to that comment about. It was a friend of mine who, knows about that story. So made a comment about getting burnt while brewing.
Yeah, you got to watch that. Yeah. We're going to pop this in a bin because I don't need it here anymore. I'm pretty sure we got rid of all the dough balls, but you know, we'll see.
Okay.
We'll suss out what the gravity is when we get there. Oh, thank you.
You've given the mash a good stir then, and basically it's just sitting there. I'm looking at, it's just below 66 degrees, so it's coming back up to mash temperature.
Yep. So I'm shooting for 66, 67 today. Bang in the middle of the happy range for the enzymes that we're working with. Should give us a nice balanced beer. I guess we could kind of touch on enzymes a little bit, just in case anybody is new to brewing and want to know what happens in the mash. So effectively, we have barley, which is a type of grass. The seeds from that barley store their energy in the form of starch, which is like a complex carbohydrate. Yeast, which we use to ferment beer, can only handle simpler carbohydrates. So we need to do something to that energy in order to make it available for the yeast to eat it. So there's a process called malting, which if you've ever heard of activated almonds, it's like that, but it's for beer, basically. Less wanky as well. So effectively you trick those seeds into thinking it's time to grow into grass, like you flood them, dry them, flood them, dry them, take them through the seasons, and it's like, oh, time to sprout, they sprout, and then you halt that process, kiln them to different degrees. And what that does is it unlocks all of the enzymes within the little grain that it uses to break down that starch to utilize it as energy to grow into a plant and do the things that it needs to do. So we want those enzymes to be unlocked because we're going to utilize them to make it into beer. So we get that malt at all sort of different levels of kilning. Some malts kilned wetter, some malts kilned drier, some malts kilned at lower temperatures for longer, some malts kilned at higher temperatures for shorter.
It's quite a science.
It really is.
It's quite a precise process they do.
And over the last sort of 10 or 15,000 years that we've been making beer, we've really gotten it down to a very precise science now. So commercial malting facilities have so many sensors and probes and things that they know exactly the humidity levels, the temperature, all those things, and they can monitor very closely what's going on with the malt and get really consistent results. So you've probably heard, if you've been around the traps, like the forums and reading the books and those sorts of things about well-modified malt. And a huge part of why modern malt is so well modified, and by that I mean there's not just starch converting enzymes in the grain, there's other things as well, like there's beta-glucanase, which breaks down the sort of gummy kind of characters of the grain. The hemicellulose structure is a term that I read in a book once that I don't fully understand, but I like to repeat because it makes it sound really cool. Yeah. And there's a bunch of protein enzymes and things as well. And they've figured out how to push the process far enough that all of those enzymes do their job, break down all those other things so that all that's left to do for the brewer is convert the starches into sugars. And from a commercial perspective, that's really useful because it means you don't have to worry about multiple step mashes and all those kinds of things. You can just lock in a mash, get the sugar converted in a really short amount of time, and keep your turnaround going nice and quick. As a home brewer, I guess we don't have the same financial incentive to knock beers out really quick. We might have a sort of, I guess, a personal time incentive if we've only got a limited amount of time to brew. I mean, I have 3 kids. It definitely makes me sort of think pretty hard about blocking out chunks of time to be spending in the garage brewing. But it can be nice as well to do some older brewing techniques and use some grains that aren't quite as well modified and play around with different ways of dealing with that, because it does produce different results and different flavors. And I think that's a really cool thing. As most of you who've seen these streams will know, I'm a bit of a history nerd. I like connecting myself to the brewing tradition, the 10,000 odd years of ancestors that have picked up mash paddles before us. And I think that's a really cool thing that you can do as well, is kind of drop yourself into that paradigm of when you needed to do a decoction mash because that was the way that you got the grains to do what you needed them to do. So yeah, there's lots of different options, lots of different ways that you can play. And you can get really sort of deep and complex with it. Or you can just dump a bunch of malt into some hot water between 60 and 70 degrees for roughly an hour, and at some point beer's going to happen. So you can keep it as simple or take it as far as you want. I feel like most people that go into all grain though, they have the tendency to want to explore a lot of those things to really kind of personalize the beers that they're making. Like we make the fresh wort kits here on our sort of 500 litre or 1,000 litre now Brewmeister system. And if all you want is just to make beer that tastes really good, you can grab wort kits, take them home, and they're going to come out awesome every time, as long as you don't stuff up the fermentation. But that goes for regardless, whatever beer you're doing. Once it hits the fermenter, it's the same process to get it into the keg or the bottle. Whereas I feel like most people that want to do the all grain are doing it because they have ideas and kind of a creative spark that they want to kind of play with those ideas and pursue different flavors and kind of make really personalized beer or make beer that sort of is by their own design. And I think some of those kind of more extended techniques or like more deeper reading and those kinds of things like really help to facilitate the process of achieving that. Like it boosts your kind of your knowledge and your I guess intuitiveness. Yeah,
you can a bit more confidence to tweak those variables.
Yeah, the more things you play with, the more it kind of fills out the picture. So like there's this thing called brewing, and there's all these different processes. And the more of those processes you play with and you read about and you put into practice, the more it kind of informs other processes and other things that you were already doing, and it kind of fills out, paints a broader picture, and you start to get a deeper understanding of what it is you're actually doing. And that, like, even if you're doing the simplest beer, like West Coast IPA is a relatively simple beer, but having that extra kind of context, I guess, it informs the way that you approach that, and I think that's a really cool thing. So, you know, hopefully people come on here, watch these streams, and get exposed to some different things that they might not have done before, and have a crack at them. We definitely recommend having a crack at all the things that we do on these channels.
There are plenty of resources out there. Well, it is difficult to go into a lot of detail in the streams about particular topics, but on Enzymes, for example, if you want to do a bit of extra reading, John Palmer is you know, really good place
Especially
to start.
About water.
And from the very basic to quite sort of heavy advanced stuff. do a bit of reading or a bit of a search around the Googles for enzymes and how it relates to brewing, and grab yourself a beer and sit down for an hour and just have a read, and yeah, you'll pick up some tricks that you can use.
The malt book is amazing for mashing and enzyme related stuff as well.
Yeah,
so,
okay.
So we've got 4 books that we sell. We've got water, yeast, malt, and I think it's called For the Love of Hops.
Ah, yes, yep.
It's sort of like the 4 ingredients of beer, and they're all sort of that thick.
Yeah.
Go into a lot of very intense detail. A lot of it sort of goes over my head. I'm a musician, not a scientist, as I love to say. But the malt one I really got a lot out of, talking about why they kiln Munich malt in a more humid kiln than they do Vienna malt, for example, and like all those little things. This is how you get this type of Maillard reaction, and this is how you get this type of coloration, and it really kind of I don't know, it just sort of really kind of gives you a bit more of an understanding of what you're working with that stuff. And I think the hops one is meant to be really good as well.
Yeah, the water one is good. I did read it and understood about a page of it, I think. But,
That was me to miss. But that said though, the yeast book, I read as much as I could. I didn't get a lot of it, but the stuff that I did get drastically changed the way that I approached fermentation and yeast management and all those sorts of things. So I think even if you don't fully comprehend all of the biology and the sort of science that they go into, you still definitely get a lot out of just looking at the ingredients in a different way, looking at the components in a different way. I think is a worthwhile exercise, having a crack at it.
And it's
like when I was 19 and decided I was going to read Stephen Hawking's Brief History of Time.
Oh yeah, okay, yeah.
Because, you know, like it was the height of the new atheist movement, and I was like, oh yeah, I'm going to be like a man of science or whatever, and then I just like realised how completely out of my depth I was. But it had some cool stuff in there as well.
No,
like I didn't take all of it on board, but the stuff I did was cool. It was interesting.
So yeah, that's back to the point about reading books. You pick up more than just blindly copying recipes. So that's a good tip if you really want to take your knowledge to the next level. Consider investing in a book. Google is, I guess, your next best option. It's free and it's convenient, but finding a source you can trust, is again.
It's free to publish information on Google, so there's oftentimes nobody's gone through and kind of fact checked.
The vetting process can vary.
Yeah.
So yeah, if you're going to do it, consider finding trusted sources. John Palmer is one, and there's lots of names in the brewing world that you can trust the stuff they put out there.
You've got to put it into practice, though. That's the other thing. You can't just read a book and be like, "Yeah, I'm a brewer now."
Yeah.
You've got to put it into practice, because a lot of it doesn't make sense until you're doing it.
And I guess also relating in a similar way, we're going off topic for the recipe, but David's sort of asking about a question about he's making a stout and he's wanting to get a nutty profile into it. So adding nuts or legumes to the mash be feasible method for getting a nutty profile in his beer.
Have a lot of fat in them.
So this is going to be an interesting,
So you can, but you are going to introduce a lot of oils into the beer, and oils kill head retention. So there are a few ways that people try to get around that. Depending on the nut that you're using, I know peanut butter, you can get powdered peanut butter, which is like being dehydrated. A lot of people use that when they want to get it in there. A lot of people will siphon the beer out from under the slick of oil on top of the surface.
Oh yeah. Or consider using a type of malt that has a nut. It depends on what you're going for, I would say, but if you're going for like nuts, then yeah, maybe I would advocate the peanut butter powder is really good, and it tastes, but you drink the beer, it's like, okay, that's peanut butter. But if you just want a nutty kind of express, like a little note,
do you know where they get the crusher?
consider using a malt that has a nut character to it, and I can't think of any off the top of my head, of course, because that's the way it goes.
I'm just going to run around the corner very briefly.
Okay, you got to do a thing. Okay, well I'll take over.
Just keep talking nuts and
I'll keep talking about nuts. Yeah. So yeah, let me see if I can cover this adequately. Again, I hazard against searching for Google, but going through Google, but maybe do a bit of a look around at what people are doing in their beers, and look at a few recipes that are going for a similar, achieving a similar goal. But ultimately, David, it comes down to what, when you say you want nuts, a nut profile in the beer, how strong you want that to be, and exactly how you want it to express. So find a nut powder, I think, or an extract. I know people use, for hazelnuts, for example, people use, what's the liqueur? Is
Frangelico.
Frangelico, thank you. Add a bit of Frangelico to the fermenter, and then you get instant hazelnuts. But it's a very strong flavour. If you're just wanting a little bit of a nut accent, I would advocate trying to find a malt that has a nutty profile. Marisota, I believe, it's a sort of a nutty character, and some brown malts too. Maybe look up a nut brown recipe.
Brown malt's awesome.
Yeah, brown malt. Yeah,
brown malt's like coffee.
Yeah.
Like somewhere between coffee and like slightly taken too far toast.
Yeah.
Just depending on your toast preferences, but for me, like toast that's just that little bit past the good range.
Yeah, right. Just a little bit of.
Like on my childhood toaster, like just on the 4 side of between 3 and 4.
Yeah. Yeah. Cool. Yeah.
I thought that was a universal thing, but apparently all toasters have different.
So yeah, again, there's no hard and fast answer to that question, but I hope we've given you some inspiration, at least, David. And if anyone else out there has any tips on that question, pop them in the chat or in the comment section below if you're watching.
I actually think it's a really fun exercise trying to achieve different flavors only using malt, hops, and yeast.
I think it's worthwhile. Yeah,
it's like a real sort of fun way to challenge your brain. I used to come up with all these wacky ideas, and then because I'm a bit of a German beer nerd, I'd like to say, can I make this crazy idea and still be like Reinheitsgebot, which is like the German brewing purity law.
Yes.
Of sort of, you can only use malt, hops and water to make your beer.
Yep. And if you don't, you get taken to jail. The beer jail.
Yeah. They take it very seriously. It's public execution if you try to put something else in your beers over there. Not really.
No.
But
we kid the Germans. We love.
It's a really fun exercise, and it kind of pushes you to think laterally as well, which is really fun. Yeah. And there's so many hops available now. There's so many different malts. Like we have 50 or 60 different types of malt, I think, that we sell. We've got at least 30 hops, and there's so many different combinations of flavors and things that go on with it. And then that's before you even start playing with the yeast. Some yeast gives you banana flavors or clove or cinnamon, or some yeast gives you peach and nectarine. Some yeast gives you nothing. So you can really play with it. One of my favorite yeasts gives you cookie dough.
Oh, which one's that?
The Bavarian Lager, the 2206.
Oh, okay.
It brings the malt up in a way that reminds me of cookie dough.
Yeah, okay, cool.
I did
not being a lager.
Somebody asked me to do a beer once that was like a hot cross bun.
Oh yeah, okay.
So we sort of thought, oh yeah, well, we use some special beef for the kind of burnt currants kind of flavour, and I think probably some brown malt as well for that toastiness, and then made like a bock, so it was like a hot cross bock.
Sometimes you got to design a recipe just for the name.
Yeah, really. and then like put a bit of spice in there, and then fermented it with that 2206, so that you get that really rich doughy sort of bun flavour.
Okay. And obviously it wouldn't have tasted like hot cross buns, but there would have been.
It definitely had hot cross bun character.
It would have been, yeah. And yeah,
like if you said hot cross bun and then drank it, you'd be like,
go,
oh,
yeah, okay, yeah.
I mean, Gabs is great for that as well. If anybody in chat goes to Gabs, there's lots of really cool, fun experimental beers that the brewers try that they'd never be allowed to do normally. But for Gabs, it's kind of encouraged to go outside the square and take some big risks and make some weird things.
Yeah. Yeah, cool.
It doesn't always pay off. There was one made with ambergris one year, which was pretty rough.
I do. I wasn't.
Like perfume.
Everyone was talking about that beer. I think.
But you know what? Some people loved it.
Yeah,
some
okay, yeah.
I was one of the ones that it didn't gel for, but
yeah.
I think a lot of other people that worked here were saying it was like the beer of the night for them. So
right.
It's obviously a really polarizing flavour, but
well, yeah, it would be. But well, there you go. So a good challenge to set for yourself is. If you're going for an offbeat flavour or something, try and see if you can get that into beer using just malt and no special ingredients, and you'll get a really good appreciation for the malts that are out there as well. You'll learn a lot by setting yourself.
The West Yorkshire ale yeast can kick off an almondy sort of marzipan flavour as well.
Yeah, so malt and yeast, I should clarify.
So that could be an option too. You want to get that almond, like that bitter almond sort of character in the beer.
Yeah.
Use that yeast. A little bit warmer. It kicks it off more when it's warmer.
Yeah. So some examples where limitations
I'm just starting to riff now and coming up with ideas. But I mean, that's the fun of it. That's the joy of it. You sort of like, oh, I could do that, or I could maybe use this, and then when you're trying to do like a normal beer, then like if you're trying to do a West Coast IPA, for example, because you've experimented and played with those things, like, oh, I really liked what that hop did in that weird beer that I did, so maybe I'll use it in this context. And it, again, all just fills in the little gaps. It's the paint by numbers, and each sort of little bit of info you get, whether it's from reading or from brewing, it just kind of colours in that.
It's a little,
it just gets more and more detailed as you go.
A little notch, a feather in your cap. So, all right, good tips.
Wort's looking good. it's clarifying slowly. So let's talk about the grist. I think that's probably a good time to do that. Because this is a stream about West Coast IPAs, and I've not done a great job of staying on it. But that's part of the fun of streaming as well. Like, I love kind of getting pulled in weird directions by chat. That's part of the joy of it. So I've gone for, on the bigger side, it's about a sort of 1060, 1070, so we'll call it 1065. We'll see what happens. Because I am using a bit more grain than the Brewmaster usually sort of deals with, it may hit the efficiency a little bit. So I reckon 1065 is a reasonable number to shoot for. And West Coast IPAs have changed a lot since they started. So I'm going for more of the, I guess you'd say, modern style. It's kind of like weird to say modern now, because probably like 5-10 years ago now, but the style that was really big immediately before NEPAs just took over, and that was all anybody brewed. So like really kind of fairly light malt profile, no crystal malt, like nothing sort of heavy and cloying, but still a decent body, decent sort of amount of kind of maltiness, and a very large amount of hops. but we'll get to that later. So I've basically, what I had done for this stream is I'd spent a bit of time going over a whole bunch of different resources. So like looked through Vinny Chilurzo from Russian Rivers, stuff that he's done. I looked at a bunch of stuff from Stone Brewing, Green Flash, like all these sort of really sort of, what's the word, quintessential West Coast IPA brewers.
Yeah, they're sort of known for.
Like when you say West Coast IPA, these are the names that just leap out of the imagination. And I looked at all of those folks, what they'd written about, what they'd been doing, found a bunch of recipes from some of the brewers associated with those breweries, and then I kind of pieced something together from that. Unfortunately, that recipe got deleted by mistake. So today's recipe was thrown together in 4 minutes before I had to race off to get the kids from school yesterday. But I think I got the gist of it.
You had all that research behind you when you were.
Yeah. So I've basically, it's mostly Pilsner malt. So I've gone with the Joe White signature Pils. Largely because I like the flavour of it.
Yeah. Okay.
This is really nice malt.
This is a new. Is this a new malt by Joe White, or is this what's one
newish? We've had it maybe a year or two now.
It's new to us.
It's hard to know. Like time has just kind of lost all meaning in the last sort of couple of years. But like I feel like we've had it maybe 2 years. We'll say.
Okay. Yeah, I've yet to use it.
Last year doesn't count as anything.
No, let's scratch that from memory. But yeah, it's a slightly more better a malt than their standard ale.
It's just got a bit more character to it.
Yep.
I really love the Joe White standard Pilsner as well. I think as like a really simple building block for a beer where malt isn't necessarily the hero.
Yep.
It's a great sort of neutral thing to use. And I use that on a lot of my hoppy beers. Because it keeps out of the way of the hops, lets the hops shine through.
Sure.
And that's really, I think, the aim for most of these things. I did want a slight bit of a kind of bready, biscuity kind of character to this though, and I think using the signature versus the export will just give me a little bit more of that. Mm-hmm. What's going to give me a lot more of that is the Vienna and the Munich malt that I've used in there.
Okay.
So I put in 400 grams of Munich malt and 800 grams of Vienna malt. So rather than using crystal malt, which can be quite heavy and cloying and sweet, and it also I find gets in the way of hops. When you use crystal malt, it really gets in the way of hops, kind of inhibits their ability to kind of punch through, and that's something that I don't find you get with toasted malts like Vienna and Munich.
And yeah, there was a period in Australian craft brewing for a while, I don't know, maybe 10 years ago, where locally made IPAs were very like crystally, it was sweet and super bitter, but just it was just a thing, I guess.
There was a period in American.
I guess we were just following what they were doing too. So not the local brewers.
I guess like now it's probably not the worst. Like we'll get into it in a few seconds. Like sort of where the style kind of evolved from.
Yeah.
Because it's a good.
Okay. Yeah. Good. Well,
I said there wasn't going to be much history. So I can't.
No, it's been. There'll be a history lesson, but that will give the recipes context. So it's good to know that.
Yeah, but they're definitely they started as pretty much British pale ales with American hops.
Yeah.
It was kind of the starting point for a lot of these beers. So yeah, there was a lot of crystal malt in them.
And so I think if we talk about our palates, how they evolve. Look, my palate now, anything that has crystal in it, I just avoid in my recipes for IPAs and things like that. It's go for light malts and
it took time to figure that out.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
But I think also as our palates have evolved and we were more able to deal with just pure hop, the crystal masking, taking the edge off the hops was a good thing. When people weren't used to it.
We were getting that.
But when we all sort of became psychopaths chasing enamel stripping levels of bitterness, all of a sudden it was like, no, I need the full hop experience. This is getting in the way, and that's when we sort of started to see all that stuff coming out, and the malt bills becoming a lot cleaner and a lot sort of more sort of cereally, grainier kind of malt characters rather than
the sweet,
the more beefy, sweeter kind of. It was that balance thing of balancing the malt and the hops.
Yeah, sure, yeah. So anyway, if you want to use crystal in your recipes, go for it. But it's modern day.
I recommend going for a lighter crystal. So I know with our hoppy beers that we do here, we do use Carahel.
Oh yes. So it's still technically crystal, but it is the lightest crystal.
It's one of the lighter ones you can get your hands on, and it's also I find that the German caramel malts don't have as much of a cloying richness to them. So even if you wanted to use a darker crystal malt, going with a German caramel in your hoppy beers is going to help avoid some of that kind of cover up.
Right. So Wyman, they're
So your Caramunics, yeah, Cara Aromas, Cara Reds,
Yep.
Cara Hells, all those types of malts. It's a slightly more acidic flavour you get from them, and it's a slightly less rich flavour that you get from them. And that's it's probably a combination of things. It's the type of barley that they're using, it's the malting process that they're taking it through. And it's just something that I've found over the years from experimenting. And I would also say that take that advice with a grain of salt, because maybe you want a richer, sweeter flavor. Like maybe you make a beer and you're like, you know what, this is missing. Nice, big, rich, sweet hit of caramel. That's what I want in my life. And because you're making the beer for yourself.
For yourself, exactly. You make it, you know, you're the one drinking it. So yeah, do what.
The only right answer
like,
is the one that you like.
But my own preference is I would advocate for leaving the crystal out.
Yeah.
But do what you like, people.
And if you're brewing to style, so if you're entering this in, like say you're entering Vic Brew or something, and or the Merry Mashers have their IPA comp as well, and you're wanting to tick off the boxes in the style guidelines, or more importantly, you're wanting to appease the judges, because the judges are going to have a very strong idea of what a West Coast IPA or like a US IPA is as well. That's when you might sort of think less about necessarily what you love the taste of and more about what's going to kind of tick those boxes. I think most of the judges now judging US IPA are going to be looking for that lighter malt bill in this style of beer. I mean, there's categories like red IPA, which are a lot more crystal heavy.
Brown, American browns.
Brown IPA.
Brown IPA, I guess it's the same thing.
I hated brown IPA as a category until I had a really good one at an IPA comp once. I got put on brown IPAs at Merry Mashers one year, and I had a couple of really good ones, and that totally sold me on it. Same with black. Like I thought black IPA is an abomination until I had a really good one at a homebrew comp, and I'm just like, oh, it's just, you know, I just hadn't had a good one yet. And you know, it's a testament to the amazing homebrewers of Melbourne that they're opening my eyes to these styles that I prematurely had written off.
Yeah, I still written off black IPAs, I have to admit, but brown IPAs are one of my favourite styles, having just crystal, but they're dry. The thing about brown IPAs is they're dry.
That's the key.
It's not sweet. It might look brown, and there's roast to it,
subtle
but it's dry.
Just takes the edge off it.
Something about that I really like.
It's like a nice coffee.
Yeah,
with fruity hops. It's
a
really
beautiful sweetness. It's
black IPA is still the only one that I put on my don't put me in this category. Like when you're doing your judging form for comps, and it's like, are there any categories you don't want to judge? And I just always say black IPA, because I'm just thinking, if you're sitting there for 2-3 hours or whatever drinking black IPA after the second or third one, you're not tasting anything. There's the amount of roast and bitterness and stuff that's going on in your mouth. No amount of water and crackers is going to get rid of that. So we've got 4.8 of Signature Pils, 800 grams of, I've gone with Best Vienna just because we didn't have the Joe White Vienna on our copy of Beersmith yet. It's a new one. 400 grams of Best Munich, and I've got 100 grams of acidulated malt. And that kind of ties into, again, the water chemistry thing. Because I threw this recipe together, I didn't have a chance to like play with the water calculators and figure out exactly what I needed to get it there, but I knew it was going to be a pretty pale beer based on the fact that the darkest malt in there is like a light Munich. And that I was going to need some kind of acidification to get the pH into the good range for a mash, which is around 5.1 to 5.4. You don't want to sort of go too far either side, or I mean, you really don't want to go anywhere either side of that. They're like the extremes. Unless you're doing German stuff, but that's another conversation.
It's a whole other stream.
Yeah, so I've put in 100 grams of acid malt because I know that that's not going to take me too far down, but it's probably going to get me into the rough range where I need to be for this type of beer. And one of the things, and this is one of those IPA specific tips, they're starting to come in now, guys. One of the things that is really common with this particular type of West Coast IPA, the paler malt ones, is soapiness and astringency.
Yes.
It's a super, super common thing.
Yeah.
Even in some commercial examples, I won't say all or even most, because let's be honest, commercial brewers know what they're doing most of the time. There's no prerequisite to knowing what you're doing to open up a brewery, but we're really lucky in this country that we've got lots of really good brewers that are making really good beers. But yeah, it's not hitting that. When you're making a beer that's got a really light malt profile, one of the things that acidifies the mash and brings it down into that good pH range is darker malts and crystal malts. If you don't have any of those in your grist, the pH is only going to go so low. So I think a standard base malt in distilled water, mashed, will only go down to, I think it's 5.8 pH, which that's a long way still to go to get into that range where you're not going to be running into those soapiness and astringency issues. And a lot of these beers don't have much else than that in them. So it really is important to be thinking about that and thinking about making an acid addition or putting some acid malt into your mash. Those water calculators like brewersfriend.com, Brew and Water. Beersmith has a water calculator built into it now in a new version, version 3. Getting on those and doing some basic calculations from your source water and the grains that you're using. And I know we talked about rainwater before, and that's where just putting a bit of acid malt is just a good insurance policy. Okay. Doing those things to get you in that pH range is something that when I started, everyone said, oh, don't worry about that until you're 20, 30 brews in. Now I'm more inclined to sort of say, start thinking about that on brew 3 or 4.
Okay, just do it.
You don't have to go too deep into it. You don't have to like go fully into like chemistry and everything. Most of those free online calculators, all you got to do is plug in the numbers and it will give you a really accurate estimation as to what it predicts your mash is going to be. The Brewer's Friend one, I've only ever been 0.1 of a pH out, which I know that is not an insignificant amount, but it's a small enough amount that it gets me in the ballpark of where I need to be pretty much every time. And there are a bunch of things that you do as a brewer which you feel like you don't see like a big impact in your beers. So like little best practice tips that you pick up along the way that you think like, oh, did that really change it? But they all kind of accumulate to a much better beer at the end. So if you dropped all of those best practices out, you'd see a noticeable difference. But then there's a few that you notice an immediate massive difference. One of them is that we always talk about here is temperature control with your fermentation, like having the ability to control the temperature at which yeast is fermenting. One of them is proper yeast management, so making sure you're pitching enough yeast, that it's healthy, that you've given it a starter if need be. And one of the biggest ones for me was water chemistry. Just taking that time, not anything too extreme, but just taking that little bit of time to figure out roughly where my pH was going to be, using a calculator that someone had put a bit of effort into to, like they'd designed all the kind of parameters and stuff. That simple step made all of my beers overnight just take a massive jump in quality. So I really do recommend thinking about it earlier on in your brewing career, because sometimes if a lot of people that get into brewing have a fairly high standard when it comes to beers, because we're quite often beer nerds before we want to start brewing all grain.
Craft beer fans, and then that leads to
when the beers we're making at home aren't hitting our standards, it can be a little bit of a disappointment, and it can sort of lead people to not brewing or to taking big breaks from brewing because they're just not happy with the results. I think that one little step is going to solve a lot of problems because that soapy astringent taste is such a common fault that I get in so many homebrewed beers that I've drank, and it's a relatively simple fix.
Yep.
Now, one of the reasons why I think it becomes so obvious in IPAs particularly, and particularly West Coast IPAs, is because of the piney kind of character from a lot of the hops that get used. So the way that flavors and smells and things work with our brain is that there's a bunch of different chemicals that over the course of our lifetime our brain attaches meaning to. And usually it does so in the context of other stimulants around you, or other sort of stimuli around you. So the scent of pine, we tend to associate with cleaning products.
Yes. Yep.
So when you have an astringency and a soapiness, and then you've got big pine aromas and flavors coming off it, your beer instantly becomes dishwashing liquid or floor cleaner or things like that, because your brain is looking for those connections to make to, like, what is this like thing? Like, how do I categorize this? And when it's got a few of those checkpoints, those data points lined up, it's like, oh, okay, this is that. So I think it can very quickly become that association thing. And for me, I know it's a really big problem for me. Like,
interesting.
If I like so many beers that have piney hops in it, I straight away just go to floor cleaner.
Yeah, funny. I put lemon in a beer once, and I got floor. That was it. It was floor cleaner. That's all I could. Yeah.
And that's the other thing, I guess. Like, all our brains are different. We've all encountered different connections. The classic one I always say, I probably said it on stream before, but Riggers, who used to work here, me and him had sort of a running, sort of friendly argument about Simcoe hops. I just sort of got a massive hit of blackcurrant whenever I smelt the bag, and he just thought, no, it smells like cat piss.
Yes, and that's another thing that people get
I've later found out it's the exact same. They call it the cat piss / blackcurrant chemical, or cat urine / blackcurrant.
The cat urine / blackcurrant chemical.
It's a specific compound that some people see as blackcurrant and some people see as cat urine. And obviously Riggers has spent more time sniffing kitty litter trays in his life than I have. I never had a cat growing up, but I did drink a lot of Ribena. So there's obviously like those kind of subconscious little neuron connections in our brains. Like mine have those data points mapped in a different way to what.
Yeah. And sometimes it could be a genetic thing too. I know with coriander, for example, I think I've got this right. I'm not, correct me if I'm wrong, but there's an actual gene where if you have that gene switched on or off, coriander either tastes like a lovely herb or soap, a terrible sort of soap, and that's just down to genetics. So yeah, there's
asparagus making your wee smell bad as well. Like, some people can notice the smell and others don't. There's heaps of different examples, little things like that. Yeah. So maybe it's not a big problem for a lot of you guys out there. But for me, if I'm making a piney beer or a beer with piney hops in it, I have to just be so careful that I'm not adding any other things which are going to take me down that pathway, because the second they're there, that's what I'm smelling and tasting.
And so to bring this back to water chemistry, do you find that changing that improves or the flavour of that particular content?
I don't really know, but I just know that having that soapiness or having that astringency there
doesn't help.
It's just instantly takes me there.
Got it.
So I'm very sensitive to that in hoppy beers, particularly in hoppy beers that use piney hops. And today we're using a lot of piney hops because we're making a West Coast IPA. And it was really hard to fight the temptation to go with like the Galaxy Citra Simcoe, like kind of beautiful, gorgeous hops that we all associate with IPAs nowadays.
Yes, true. Yeah, it used to be all the C hops, and now it's there's a new school of hops out there.
Yeah, but I've managed to fight the urge.
Yeah,
but I mean,
good,
even you know, before NEPAs were the kind of dominant IPA, I was still using your Galaxies and those sorts of things, just because I like those flavors.
Yeah.
But I did used to use Cascade in my earlier IPA recipes. It was a weird mix actually. I used to do Cascade, SARS, and Galaxy.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
And Goldings actually. Cascade, SARS, Goldings, and Galaxy.
Yeah, oh gee, I've forgotten the recipe now, but I did a recipe that was somewhat based on a Little Creatures recipe I found online, and apparently they used an English hop in that, which I cannot remember. So that was a pointless story, but again, not one you would expect to find in a.
Yeah, and again, it's one of those things. Like, I really liked the floral character that I got from the SARS, and the slightly kind of herbal character I got from the Goldings. Then I got the pine and the citrus from the Cascade, and then the Galaxy brought the kind of tropical fruits, and that sort of, you were getting like all these different kind of things, and playing around with the balance of those, and getting it there was kind of what I really liked. But
another reason to try get your head around your hops, and
when you're getting started, stick like if you're making an American IPA, stick to the American or the New World hops.
Yeah,
because you pretty much can't go wrong with it.
Yep. Oh, true. I mean,
but then once you've got a bit of kind of understanding, you've used a lot of different hops, you know what they're kind of going to do, then you can start experimenting. Or do what I did and straight out the gate, just like, I'm going to grab one of those,
I did
one
that
of those,
too.
one of those, throw them all in there, not measure anything, not write anything down.
Yes. So back to your tip. For those of you, learning water chemistry, learning what adds sulfate to the beer, and the importance of calcium. So I've just drawn a blank. What's the other one? Sulfate, chloride. Thank you. Yep. Learning what those are and what those ratios are is.
And there's different ways to add all those different compounds as well. If again, I'm going to be talking from a Melbourne perspective because that's where we are. If you're watching from outside of Melbourne, which a lot of you probably are, you're going to have different kind of challenges to work with, I guess, and that's just. The nature of brewing. So many beer styles, again, like style school, so many beer styles kind of sprung out of the water source that people were working with in the area, and how to make good beer with that water source before they could kind of really tweak it. But in Melbourne, we don't have much calcium in our water, so there's kind of a 5 to 10 gram minimum calcium addition that I would sort of recommend in any beer.
Yep.
And generally you're adding that in the form of calcium chloride and calcium sulfate. Calcium chloride and calcium sulfate both have acidifying effects, limited acidifying effects on the beer. Then if you needed more chloride after that, but you didn't want any more calcium, you could add sodium chloride, which is table salt. Too much sodium can kind of add a harshness though, so you've got to use that one a little sparingly. If you wanted more sulfate and didn't want more calcium, magnesium sulfate or Epsom salts is a really good option. Again, magnesium can get a little rough if you go too overboard with it, so again, a little bit of restraint. There is, if you wanted to bring the pH up, if you're doing like a really roasty stout, then some people use calcium carbonate or chalk.
Yes.
If you didn't want to add any more calcium, then you could add sodium bicarbonate, so bicarb soda. Is another way that people do that. I've even heard of people using sodium hydroxide or caustic.
Yes, I was going to say,
like food grade caustic, obviously.
Which we sell, and you've got to be very careful when using it. And if you're using it to raise your pH, it's very effective in small amounts.
Like
small amounts.
Get out your tiny tweezers and a microscope to get the right amount in there.
Probably not something to do if you're a beginner, something to work your way up to, and of course if you're using caustic gloves and goggles.
But if you're shooting for, particularly if you're shooting for a chocolate flavour in a stout or a porter, a huge part of what makes chocolate taste like chocolate is a higher pH. So making sure that your wort isn't too acidic is, and you can even do that after the mash as well. So once the mash is through, you can even still further adjust the pH of your beer. You can adjust the balance of the different salts of your beers, like the seasoning, if you will.
Yep.
As well. There's been a few studies on that, like the effects of adding brewing salts to a fermented beer. And it definitely makes an impact.
You can do it,
it definitely just changed the flavour. So you can totally do that, and it won't affect like the mechanics of the mash. So there's all sorts of things you can do. You can really nerd out with it.
Yes, it can get pretty dense. So if people are interested in learning more about that, there's actually a good article which I will link in the description of this episode eventually. It's either Melbourne Brewers, I think it's Melbourne Brewers. One of the members there did a really good introductory article. It still takes a few reads. It's like 5 or 6 pages, but it really got me into getting my head around all this stuff. It's just a really good primer, I think, for those of us who haven't done chemistry degrees or zoned out in science class in high school.
Easy, guys. There's only 4 ingredients. Just learn about. You only got to learn about 4 things, and you're fine.
Yeah, and it is not as hard as once you get your head around the fundamentals.
That was sarcasm, obviously.
Yeah. And then you can work your way up to perhaps one of the more in-depth books. And also we've got a video for one of our Good Beer Week events a year or so back with Hendo, who's a bit of a rock star in the brewing world, talking about exactly this pH in your brewing your beers, in your brewing liquor and your mash, and he talks about using caustic soda as well and handling it carefully. So yeah, get your head around your salts, your chloride, your sulfate, and your pH. Those are sort of, I guess, the 3 things.
If you only focus on those 3 aspects, you'll see a massive improvement in your beers.
Yeah.
You don't have to like worry about all those other like little finite things.
Yeah.
If you use like a online brewing calculator, you look at your chloride to sulfate ratio for your seasoning. So like chloride's going to be, treat chloride like your salt and sulfate like your pepper. Chloride's going to bring out the richness, the sweetness, the maltiness of the beer. Sulfate's going to bring out the sharpness, the kind of the punch, the definition and clarity of the flavours.
Yeah. It's sort of said sulfate brings out the hops more, or makes the hops pop. And chloride brings out the malt. I think that's an oversimplification.
Sulfate kind of sharpens the hops, and chloride dulls them. But I don't know if it necessarily inhibits the hop flavors, because obviously, like NEPAs are all about the chloride being really high, it takes the edge off.
Yep.
So with a sulfate-heavy beer, the bitterness is a lot sharper and more punchy. But also the flavors of the hops are really defined. Like you get a really sort of sharp edge on the flavors of the hops that you're using. And the same with the malt as well. Like it kind of, it's a clarification of the flavors and of the smells. Like well, I don't know about the smells, but definitely of the flavors. It sort of sharpens everything. It like turns up the contrast.
Yep. Okay, that's a good analogy. All right, good. So yeah, I hope that
turns up the treble.
Yeah, and the chloride is the base.
Yeah.
Perhaps.
Yeah, so we're about 50 minutes into demash. What I am going to do with this beer, and now's a good time to do it. Is it? No, probably not. I wasn't planning on using the Brewmaster until this morning. I want to do a first wort hop edition. I'm trying to think of the best way to do that.
Oh yeah,
I think it's going to be, once we've got the mash pipe lifted, I'll throw the hops in underneath it, and then let it drain through. I'm just kind of trying to plan it. I've even heard of like people doing mash hops. So they put hops just in the mash tun, and then sparge through, and then the hops don't end up in the kettle.
Yeah.
So that's an interesting thing as well. Like, there's all these little techniques that people have employed over the years for brewing. But I think
somewhat controversial too, but people do it.
I think in the interest of keeping things simple with the Brewmaster, I'll do the first wort hopping and just put them in the kettle underneath as it's ramping up to boil temp. It's probably the easiest way. But you do start getting some isomerization of your alpha acids. There's a mouthful. You do start getting some isomerization happening from about 80 degrees. So if you're sparging with 80-degree water, you will extract a little bit of bitterness from the hops as you're sparging through them if you do a mash hop as well. So it's, you know, that's the thing.
And the theory is, I think, isn't it, that your first wort hops and your mash hops, the idea is that you get a finer, refined bitterness out of that addition. It somehow locks in the compounds because of science. And
because of science is the right answer.
You know, and I think there's varying opinions on whether it's true or not. But professional brewers do first wort hopping, and I know Hop Nation, I think they employ it in some of their beers, and their beers are great. So, you know.
For me, I was never great at hoppy beers. And I think, like, for a long time when I was getting started, and I've nailed it down now that it was just the yeast. The yeast, I was using like the kind of the standard American ale yeasts, and they just don't gel well with me. Since I've started using friendlier yeasts, all my hobby beers have gotten really good now. So that's something to think about as well. You know, we've all got different strategies and techniques and approaches to brewing, and yeasts have personalities and minds of their own, and sometimes you just clash.
Yeah, fair enough. Yeah, you can't get along with everyone.
Yeah. But I was sort of struggling to kind of get the character I wanted out of my hoppy beers, and like, this was around the time that Hendo was still floating around down here a lot, still coming in here a fair bit, and I sort of saw Brew Cult at the time, which was Hendo's brewery, as being, like, for me, the best hoppy beers that were being made locally. Like, there was no other brewery that was making hoppy beers that were as close to my sort of platonic ideal of what a hoppy beer should be and what I wanted to achieve with my own brewing than the stuff that Hendo was kicking out at Brew Cult. So I, you know, like, I kind of, whenever he was in, I would always kind of pay really close attention and sort of quiz him with some questions and things.
He does know his stuff.
And he did definitely say that first wort hopping is the way to go.
Oh,
so I was like, okay, cool, I'll do it.
All right, if he said it, I will accept that.
And I don't know, like, that was one conversation I had. And I just applied a lot of gravity to that conversation.
Hopefully he's still got that opinion.
I applied a lot of gravity to that conversation, and I've sort of, like, really internalized it, because I'm like, well, I mean, I'm making hoppy beers that I don't like. Hendo's making hoppy beers that I do like. So if he's saying that this is what he does, then I'll do that as well. And it can only help.
Yep.
But yeah, so, you know, that dude knows what he's talking about. He's a consultant for commercial breweries, so and he can back all of it up with science more than just saying it's science.
Better than certainly ITD.
So I think there's got to be something to it.
There is some actual science to it. I couldn't tell you what it is, but people have studied it.
It's something to do with the proteins,
right?
Like the proteins of the hops and the grains and the things, and I don't know. I don't know.
But maybe you know, if you're interested, guys, do a bit of looking into first wort hopping and see if it's right for you.
Yeah. But that's what we're doing today. We're gonna do it first wort.
And Benny's doing it.
But if you we're coming to one of those system-specific things. So if you were doing a mash lauter tun sort of thing, where you're sparging through your mash tun into your kettle, to do your first wort hop, I would probably put my hops in the empty kettle. And then run off into that, and then sparge through and then sort of top it up that way. It's probably a good way to do it. And with your single vessel things, I think the plan that I'm kind of probably going to go with here is the way to go. Like, lift your malt pipe or whatever you brew in a bag or whatever out of the mash, and throw the hops in underneath. And as it's coming up.
As it's coming up to the boil, that's what I would do as well. So yes, it's lots of these techniques were developed, I guess, either by professional brewers or back in the days when people would use 3-vessel systems, your esky, or cooler for your mash tun, and then siphon off into your boil kettle. These days we've got single vessel systems are all the rage, so your Braumeisters, Grutens, and Brazillas. Thank you. There's a whole bunch of products on the market now, and they're popular for a reason.
They were so controversial. Like the brew in a bag thing was so controversial when it came out. There's no way that'll work.
That's not how you brew beer.
Can't brew beer like that. That's ridiculous.
And look at where we are now. So, but yeah, it does mean you have to adapt some processes. You got to work out how it fits your system. And first wort hopping.
I mean, that's one of the funnest things about working here, I think, is I've gotten a chance to brew on like just about every type of configuration and system that exists. So, again, you're looking at the same processes from different angles, which is kind of fun. And we try to mix it up here on the streams. Like we'll use, I'll make an effort to try to use different systems. I don't think I've done any 3-vessel stuff.
Yeah, no, we haven't done that.
We don't really have a 3-vessel system to work with here. I've got one at home. But I actually rarely use it. I tend to pick one of the 3 vessels and do like a brew in a bag in that, just for convenience and simplicity. Yeah. But I mean, last stream we did do a 4-vessel brew. Oh really? With the lambic, the turbid mash.
Oh, of course. That's right. I was there.
We had a bucket going. Really? We had a couple of urns. We had a little pot on a camping stove. Like we had a whole bunch of stuff going on. So that was fun.
That was fun, actually.
That was really fun. I'm going to do that again. Like, it's funny. I don't really drink lambic. Like my partner, it's her favourite type of beer, but I don't really drink lambic. But that was so much fun. I kind of just want to do it again.
And it went so smoothly too.
Too smoothly. If I do it at home, I know that everything's going to stuff up. I'll get too confident, too cocky with it. Yeah. But if you haven't, go back through the videos and have a bit of a skim through that stream, because that was an absolute blast. Yeah,
I will be editing that one at some point into a more digestible chunk. But definitely, for now, just check out the stream. You can just scroll through it and you'll learn something.
It was so much fun. It was so much fun. Kind of like, it reminded me a lot of decoction mashing.
Yes, yeah. So exactly, that's another technique too. That
it's a little bit more homework or like kind of like pre-game, I guess you'd call it. Like sort of doing all your calculations, figuring out how much water at what temperatures you're going to need to get your temperature jump. So thermodynamics, guys, easily the simplest branch of physics and fluid mechanics. It really isn't. That was
all this stuff. I'll just take your word for.
Year 11 physics. I was doing pretty good with radiation. Vectors I did okay with, and when we hit thermodynamics, that's when my mark went from like an A to a C.
Oh yeah.
It was just like, there's too much. It's too much going on. I don't understand. But again, online calculators, they're so handy. If only we had access to that back in year 11, I could have aced that class. Just punched in the variables and like, oh yeah, cool, that's the answer. And that's literally what I did. I think I just went on brewersfriend.com, used their dilution.
Oh yes,
what is it there? The infusion calculator.
Okay, yeah, right.
So for like when you're adding boiling water to a mash, and you can set the temperature of the water, the volume, like all those different things, how much grain is in the mash, because that'll affect the density. And so like from doing that, it took a bit of time. I had a few tabs open, jumping between them, but I pretty much had it down to within a litre or two of each addition, how much I was going to get and how much.
Nailed it on that.
So a little bit of homework, and
goes a long way.
You end up with a nice smooth day. My first decoction was not smooth at all. It was a lot of panicking, a lot of swearing. I took a 2-hour break to play PlayStation while I was calming down, and then came back in, just ramped it up to the boil, and was done with it.
Yeah. We've all had brew days like that.
Prep work. Prep work is the key. All right, so where are we? We are 22 seconds away from the end of the first temperature step. So after that, it's going to ramp up to 78 degrees for mash out. That's just going to denature all the enzymes. It's going to make the wort nice and loose, which I think is going to be important because we've got a fair bit of grain in there. So kind of the higher the temperature of the liquid, the less dense it is, the easier it's going to run off the grain. So we will have a bit more luck in getting that off. I have not calculated how much grain I'm working with, so I've got half a kilo, 4.5, 5, 6.1 kilos of grain. So I'm going to need about 6 litres of water, which I'll rinse. Which I'll rinse through the grains. I'm going to do a cold sparge. It was a bit chaotic this morning. I didn't get a chance to set up another urn to heat up some hot water. So I'll just do a cold sparge. I'll try to use a jug so I'm at least measuring the amount of water I'm pouring through.
Oh yeah.
And I'll pour through 6 litres of water, and that should get my pre-boil volume to where it needs to be. I've brewed on this Braumeister enough times now that I'm very confident with the numbers, with how it's going to behave and things like that. But I knew I was going to forget something. I forgot to get the refractometer out. I will get the refractometer out. We'll take a measurement once we've got once we've got all the water up to where we need it to be. Once we've got it up to the 25 litre mark in the Braumeister, which is my sort of default pre-boil volume that I shoot for. We'll take a gravity reading. We'll calculate our dilution rate, so the end volume will need to be to hit our 1065 starting gravity on our wort. And then we'll ignore those numbers and pretend like they never happened, because it's all for the benefit of the viewer. It doesn't really matter. But it is a good habit to get into, and it's something that is, when you're brewing your own beer, I think it does matter. But for the purposes of this, it's going to be somewhere between 1060 and 1070, which is where I like my IPAs to sit. So it'll be sort of somewhere between 6 and 8%. And yeah, that's roughly where everything should be. I'm going to get some more water.
Cool. Well, do you want to, I think we might just take a short break.
It's probably not a bad idea.
And collect ourselves. We'll just take 5 minutes, and we'll be right back as we'll be getting into, I suppose, we're getting close to mash out, or sorry, not mash out, but removing the grains from the machine. All right, be right back. Here we are, we're back.
We're back. Cool. So because I can't help myself, I do eventually need to talk about the history and the development of the style, even if briefly, because it's, I don't know, I just love that stuff. It just fascinates me so much, like how these things came to be. And particularly, I think something like this, which is so young, like American IPAs have only been around for 30, 40 years.
Yeah.
As long as me. So it's, you know, it's kind of really interesting how out of nowhere almost, like this thing which is such a massive part of, I think, everybody watching this is life. Like, you know, craft beer wouldn't be a thing if IPAs hadn't just ejected it into the stratosphere. And generally when you say the words craft beer, like people are thinking of big hoppy beers. Like that, the two things were almost synonymous for a really long time, and kind of still are in a lot of ways. And all of that has sort of come out of just like a series of things that kind of almost incidentally led to this existing. But I think with so many American styles, you can't talk about the beer without touching on Fritz Maytag. Like, he really was just the person who made different types of beers and like craft beer like a thing that existed in America. Like, just sort of. So the story goes, in case anybody hasn't heard the story of Fritz, you probably heard of Maytag vacuum cleaners. Oh, like home appliances or something.
But,
so he was like
someone out there,
like the heir to the Maytag like appliances sort of company, and living in San Francisco. And you guys are, I mean, we might do an episode on steam beer at some point, because I think it's a really nice beer, and it's a really important beer historically. But there was a specific type of beer in San Francisco called steam beer, or also known as California Common, that was massive during the gold rush years, but had sort of tapered off to the point where there was really only one brewery making it in San Francisco in the 70s, and it was Anchor Brewing. And they were pretty much about to go under, but Fritz had been going to the brewery bar and getting this beer for like a long time. It was his favourite beer, and like when he found out that the brewery was going to go under, he was like, well, I'll buy the brewery so that we can prop it up and keep it afloat, sort of thing, because he wanted to keep drinking that beer. So that's what he did. He you know, like he had money coming from the Maytag family, so he bought Anchor Brewery and propped it up, and so that he could keep drinking his steam beer. But kind of it became an obsession, and he started like, well, I mean, we've got this one beer, but what other beers can we do? So he's like, I think I don't know if he was already active in the home brewing, like the very small home brewing community, or if he became active in it through like meeting people through the bar or through the brewery, or how it all kind of came about. But he started looking at all these kind of different styles that weren't around anymore. Like, you'd find all these old historical brewing books with recipes in them and things, and it's like, well, this one sounds interesting, let's try to make this. So like, the classic one was the porter. The porter was pretty much extinct at that point. Like, no one was brewing them anymore. Like, everyone was like, stouts were really popular, but no one was brewing porters. So he resurrected the porter from this recipe book, and everybody loved the Anchor porter that he made, and there was a bunch of different stories like that, where he's taking these old existing beers and sort of resurrecting them and making them. And I think a lot of home brewers were already doing that at home. I know that's something that I personally love to do, is find extinct beer styles and have a crack at brewing them. There's a really good book that is super cheap. I think it's under $10, that came out recently about historical German, Austrian and Hungarian beers. I can't remember the name of it. If I remember it, I'll try to get it to Joel, and we can post it in the description. But my memory is pretty shoddy at best.
Yeah, I'm with you.
But yeah, it was sort of like a bit of a trend in the homebrew scene. Whether that was due to Fritz or whether there was like kind of some kind of weird dialectical thing going on there where they were kind of feeding into each other.
Yeah.
But one of the things that he did was make an IPA. So we've talked at great length about the history of English IPA. So I don't need to really do that now, but there was maybe one or two American breweries that had kind of dabbled with it up to that point. But Fritz decided that he wanted to use American hops in it, and he had a friend who mentioned this new hop variety that was being made in California called Cascade. So he went out there and got a bunch of Cascade and threw a bunch of Cascade into this IPA, and it was called Liberty IPA. And by modern standards, we would not probably call it hoppy,
sure.
But at the time it was just a flavour that nobody had experienced before. It was a completely novel thing, had this pine and this grapefruit sort of character coming through. It was quite bitter. That bitterness was balanced probably with a lot of crystal malt as well.
As we were
based on
against.
the kind of more recent iterations of English IPAs. But that was sort of like really the origin stories of the style, I guess, in a lot of ways. And that was like late 70s, like 78, 79. Early 80s, out in Chico, California, Sierra Nevada Brewery made their pale ale. And again, it was an English pale ale recipe, and they just used the Cascade hops from the local Californian sort of
that were growing out there, yeah.
And again, at that time, that was probably the hoppiest beer that had ever been made by, like, you know, modern hoppy beer standards. Like, just dumped all of this Cascade into this beer, which, when I say all of this, it was a relatively small amount by modern standards, but at the time, like, huge doses of Cascade at various times throughout the boiling process made this piney, citrusy thing that, you know, a lot of people thought was too hoppy, but you know, it was like taking all these steps towards like this new thing. Yeah, it was like starting to form. There was one other beer in the 80s, and the name has escaped me now, which is really frustrating, but there was another beer in the 80s which was kind of a bridge to the 90s IPAs.
Right, okay.
And I can't remember what it was called. If anybody in chat knows what I'm talking about, feel free. But again, we're talking California. Yeah. Like, this is all happening in like California.
Yeah, I believe there's, and again, speaking of things you can't remember, but there was another chap, very small brewery somewhere, I don't know if it was California or it could have been way down south. I think I heard this on an episode of Basic Brewing Radio or something like that. A bit of a forgotten chapter in that early development of IPAs and pale ales, and he is sort of, and again, if anyone knows this person's name, please comment below or in the chat. Is also maybe belatedly attributed to this sort of scene in contributing in a small way. Was one of the first breweries to adopt
There was a pizza
Cascade.
shop brewery,
right,
that made a beer that was really influential in this sort of whole thing as well. And again, I can't.
So,
remember.
as if all things in history, the big sort of names often get touted, but a lot of little guys out there as well, contributing in their own way. But anyway, that was an aside.
So we're kind of at this point where this is starting to become a thing. And then in the early 90s, a very important man by the name of Vinny Chilurzo.
Oh yes, well there you go. Yeah, so yeah.
Most well known for Russian River. At the time was working for
Pizza Port?
Blind Pig or something.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Oh, sorry, what were you going to say?
I said Pizza Port, but I don't know if they were around. I think
that was
later.
All connected as well.
Right.
But he made a beer called, I think it was called Blind Pig IPA. Like my brain has just decided to shut down all of a sudden. But that was really the first just stupidly hopped, like 80, 90, 100 IBU ridiculous amounts of hops, dry hops. So that was another thing I forgot to mention was Fritz utilised dry hopping in his beer as well, which was not something that was an almost forgotten technique that was really common in British beers, like sort of 100 years or so before that. That no one really did anymore, and so he was using dry hopping with those Cascade hops as well to get that citrusy, piney character. So this was like just an insane beer that he made, and from what I understand, they aged the beer for a year on oak, and would dry hop at various times throughout that year to keep the character up and to keep the freshness up.
Talking my language,
which is just wild. And they had all these old, and I might be mixing up different stories, so I apologise if I am. But I think it was this beer. They had these like these massive post-mix like Coke syrup tanks that they got from Knott's Berry Farm, which is an awesome theme park in LA. If you're ever in LA, skip Disneyland and go to Knott's Berry Farm.
I've heard of it.
The roller coasters are 100 times better. There's hardly any lines because everyone goes to Disneyland instead. And I think it's Snoopy themed. Snoopy?
Snoopy. Oh, okay.
I think. I'm trying to remember. It's been a good 20 years since I was there. 10 years, 20 years, 20 years since I went there. But it was really fun. Recommend it. But you probably won't find yourself in California anytime next decade, I'm guessing.
Yeah, we can dream.
Unless you live there, in which case you already know about Knott's Berry Farm. But yeah, they had these massive post-mix Coke syrup containers from Knott's Berry Farm that they were storing the beer in. And yeah, it was just like created this beer that most people hated.
I can imagine.
But a small handful of people loved. And it was pretty close to that time that Stone kind of popped up as well and started doing similar wild things. Green Flash wasn't too far after that as well. And Green Flash, I think, is a really important one for this style because they were the ones that came up with the term West Coast IPA. So Green Flash brought out a beer literally called West Coast IPA. That really defined the style, and people started using that term after that. But I think they had it copyrighted at one point.
Okay.
But people were referring to their beers as West Coast IPAs, and I think like that was like the kind of definitive beer that people were like, it's a West Coast IPA, and you think of the Green Flash beer, like it was this sort of thing. But it was basically became an arms race in the 90s. So like all these different Californian breweries were just seeing how many more hops they could throw into their beers. It was getting more and more intense. And by the time it hit the 2000s, it was going completely wild. Vineyard sort of moved on to Russian River, was doing the Pliny beers. So Pliny the Elder, Pliny the Younger. And I think it was 2011, I want to say, where he, on the release date, what was it? They went through something like 80 kegs in 4 hours of Pliny.
Wow.
At the brewery, and it was just like, oh shit, something's happening now. Like this is a thing. And it's at the point now where like if they're releasing a Pliny beer, the line goes for miles of people trying to get to the brewery to get their hands on it.
Is it still? I've never.
I don't know.
Pliny is one of those mythical beers that everyone talks about, and one day I hope to try it. But is it easily? Can you easily get it in California, or is it just out of stock all the time?
I think a lot of bars stock it, but again, I don't know. I mean, when I was in America, when I was in California, I was 15, 16, so not really in a position to be trying all the amazing beers that were on offer, unfortunately.
If there are any Americans watching, let us know. How easy is it to get Pliny in California, and can you get us some?
Yeah, it'd be interesting to see if it's kind of changed. Like, because I know, like now that sort of thing is true of Alchemist. So, like like when they're releasing like Heady Topper and stuff, you sort of have people lining up to get the fresh.
Yes, it's all that NEEP is the new thing.
Anyway, so many people make them now. It's just like, I can probably get something pretty good. That isn't Heady Topper, but as somebody who's drank it. It's not as good.
Oh, you've had it, have you?
Yeah. An awesome customer actually bought in a couple of cans of Alchemist beers from their American trip in here for me and John to taste one night. And they were just phenomenal. Like I thought I had my head around NEPAs as a style, and drinking that was like, I still have so far to go to get even close to this level of mastery, and like it was just incredible, absolutely incredible.
And for those of you who perhaps we've lost you, Heady Topper, Alchemy is the brewery that makes Heady Topper, which was, I guess you could say, defines NEPAs as a style. It's one of the beers, one of the breweries that I guess you could say is the quintessential NEPA. Since we're talking about quintessential West Coast IPAs, every style, I suppose, or every modern style has its craft beer origin sort of I don't know, I'm trying to lose my words, but I'm trying to...
You have those big beers that push the whole
explosion
thing in a specific, like a very definitive direction, and I think like it really was like your Stone IPA, your Green Flash West Coast IPA, your Russian River beers, and that, I'm pretty sure it was Blind Pig IPA.
Okay, yep.
I'm like 90% sure, but
I'll defer to you.
I could be getting it wrong. I was reading a heap of stuff last night, and like I'm trying to remember. I did read not last night as well, but like I was reading a bunch of stuff last night that I hadn't come across before, and I was like, oh, that's really interesting. I'll try to remember that today. But
yeah.
But yeah, like these beers that really and obviously the Sierra, the Anchor Liberty IPA and the Sierra Nevada Pale Ale as well, that were really the kind of the initial pioneers for moving in that direction. I mean, you had other breweries like in other parts of the country that were doing interesting things as well. So like Dogfish Head out in Rehoboth, I think, is where they are, like up in New England, like northeastern sort of.
Dogfish.
Rhode Island, I think, is the state that they're in.
Yeah,
or somewhere around that area. So Sam Calagione is one of those really awesome experimental, quirky sort of beer guys.
I always get them and Russian River mixed up. Russian River in Delaware, is that right, or is that? Maybe they got it. Maybe I'm thinking of Dogfish Head. Anyway, ignore me.
So Dogfish Head.
I think they've got a few.
Dogfish Head are one of those breweries that are always like pushing envelopes, and they're like, that was a brewery that really sparked my interest in beer archaeology. It's like resurrecting dead styles and looking at like kind of interesting stories and trying to like brew beers from like the past.
Yeah.
So they've played around a lot with Chicha. They did a show once on TV that was pretty short-lived, but he had all of his staff members chewing on this purple Peruvian corn and spitting it into little spit containers.
Imagine going on a brewery tour that day and looking at that. Is this how you make your beer?
Yeah. So basically trying to make like a big batch of chicha with the corn processed in a traditional way, because our spit has a lot of amylase enzymes in them, and amylase is the enzyme that the grains have currently been using to convert the starches to sugars. So the story goes, in Peru, all the people working the farms will be chewing on the corn as they're working, spitting it in a little bucket, and then that all gets collected and herbs added, boiled, and that's how you make the chicha.
Yes, that's where
the chicha.
Yeah, I'm not sure.
Really interesting stuff.
Yeah.
But they had the 60-minute, the 90-minute, and the 120-minute IPA.
Yep.
And that was a process he created called continuous hopping, which was sort of inspired by the way that you're constantly seasoning at different points throughout cooking.
Yeah, okay.
Like, you add salt at this point, you add salt at this point. So rather than just adding all the salt at the end and it just tastes horrible, like bland and salty, by seasoning at different points, you're adding the seasoning to this ingredient, to that ingredient, and bringing out the flavors of it.
Absorbs into, the different parts of the dish.
He kind of applied that principle or that kind of idea, but just from like constantly feeding hops into like the whole way through the boil until the whirlpool.
Had a machine, didn't he? That was it was a football. I think the legend is a football
something like that,
thrower or something, and it was a conveyor belt, and they just poured hops onto it, and it was just continually
going through. So the 60-minute IPAs the beer's continuously hopped for 60 minutes.
At a
The 90
steady
minutes
rate.
for 90 minutes, the 120 minutes for 120 minutes. And the beers go up in gravity to match the amount of extra hops and bitterness that they're going to have as well. So there's lots of people experimenting with ways to cram as much hops into beers as possible as well. And that was sort of 90s as well.
Yeah, that was the 90s.
Doing that.
Everyone in their flannies. And
listening to Stone Temple Pilots and smashing hops into their kettles.
It was the 90s.
That's exactly what was happening.
Exactly what,
But but really, if you've ever had those dogfish shaped beers, which you can occasionally get grey imports here.
You can find them here and there if you keep a lookout,
They're very different from your West Coast offerings.
Yeah, right.
The West Coast offerings just have that brightness, that sharpness, that punch, that clarity. The 60, 120, 90 minute ones, they're kind of a bit muddy, they're delicious, but I'd almost call they're more branching into American barley wine territory.
Okay, yeah, right. East Coast.
Yeah, it's just a different vibe, man. They don't have the sun and the surf and all that. Yeah.
They don't know how to party. That's their problem.
Yeah. So that's the a basic overview.
Background, and then led, I guess, that spirit of pushing boundaries and flavour thresholds has led to the IPAs that we have now. NEPAs and milkshake IPAs and double dry hopped. Cacao nibbed coffee, first wort coffee, what's-its, and they're all some sort of IPA, but
and it really was. I think those early beers with those like devotees who became obsessed with them and probably went off to start their own breweries and were experimenting with those ideas, and then that kind of organically, gradually over time led to more and more people developing that lupulin threshold.
True. As consumers, I guess, as craft beer fans, as a collective, we all our taste evolved with them, And
so what we consider brutally hoppy now. Well, actually, I should say what they consider brutally hoppy then we would see as a norm
as a session beer now.
It's really shifted.
It's interesting. I never thought of it.
And those
that way.
early sort of breweries played a massive part in that. I guess a consequence of that all happening as well, when everyone's trying to cram as much hops into their beer as they possibly can, is like you can't just use. If every single brewery is like in this arms race and doing these things, they're all using Cascade. They're all pulling out the same beers, which is kind of what we're seeing now with like the Citrus Simcoe Mosaic Galaxy thing, where like every beer that comes out has the same 3 or 4 hops in it, or variations of it. It's sort of like, oh yeah, this is a good version of that one beer.
Yes, it does, and on that point, and I think I was having a chat with Oscar one day about this, where we were eventually saying we really love NEPAs, but we were just getting a bit sick of them, and there are some really good examples out there, but I was just like, it's another NEPA, it's good, but and I guess that's just what happens, when the market gets saturated or when something catches on, and then someone else will come along with something new and different, and that'll be the next thing.
But I guess sort of where I was going with it is the reason why we have so many amazing varieties of hops with all these different characteristics and fruitiness and things like that is that the IPA explosion led to a very big shift in the way that hop farming was undertaken. So it was very much like like most things, when it comes to like commercial agricultural products, it was a monoculture sort of thing. It's like plant as many fields of Cascade as we possibly can because that's what everyone was wanting. As that went on, like breweries were wanting different hops. They were wanting something else, something that would make their beers stand out from the 800 Cascade beers that were on the market. So that led all the like different hop sort of labs and farms and stuff to start experimenting with crossbreeding and different like planting conditions and all those things to develop all these new hops like your your Citras and your Mosaics and your Amarillos and
There's some
your
crazy stuff out
Nuggets
there now,
and your Stratas and your Sabros
lemon drop and well, like I said, a lot of Germany. Germany are getting into the
they are now,
you know,
and that's as a result of
fruity hop game.
the success of these types of beers. But
Just shows you.
it completely changed the way that hop farming was done. These beers, like everyone was trying to make the new cool hop instead of trying to make a heap of the one hop that everyone wanted. So this, you know, the classic thing is like the potatoes, right? Like I don't think it's russet. I think it's a specific type of potato that McDonald's uses to make their chips.
Okay.
And I can't remember the percentage, but it's a terrifyingly large percentage of the amount of potatoes grown in the United States are that variety of potato, because McDonald's demands so many chips.
Yes.
That everyone who's going into potato farming is like, oh yeah, we'll just make the McDonald's potato because that's what everyone wants. So
well,
like, the whole country is just growing this one variety of potato, and it's actually kind of, sorry, I'm just moving around.
That's all right.
Making Joel follow me with the camera. It's kind of dangerous because when you get big monocultures like that happening, things like
Pests and
specific
disease.
pests and diseases and things that certain varieties are susceptible to, if one disease comes in that they weren't expecting or hadn't seen before, that can wipe out your entire potato crop and you're doomed. And I think that's, you know, we've seen it happen lots of times in the past.
Yeah.
I think it's a really important thing. I mean, like in the West generally, we suck at farming. Like we really suck at farming. We're terrible at it. But I think it's something that needs to be thought about, and at least in the hops world, like people are kind of, I mean, now it's probably going back the other way. Everyone's just planting 3 paddocks of Simcoe for every 1 paddock of something interesting.
Yeah, well, I guess every hop has its day in the sun too. I remember Amarillo was the big thing for a while, and
Amarillo changed a lot. Amarillo, when it came out, was super stone fruity, and then it sort of shifted to something else.
You changed Amarillo, you changed man.
I'm just getting a ladder.
Yeah, okay, interesting. Ben's just going to grab a steppering uppering apparatus. I think we're about to pull out the malt pipe.
Indeed we are. And I'm going to grab the first hop edition as well, which I'll put in. I should have scissors over here.
So yeah, I hope that was interesting for you guys out there. We went on a bit of a tangent at the end there, but was there anything? Maybe we can circle back to the history if Ben wants to in a sec. I'm going to get out of the way.
Oh, this is a bit sticky. I apologise for the loud noise. This was a little bit sticky, and I didn't really want whatever was making it sticky to end up in the beer. Although it is hot side, so you can get away with a lot more before the boil than you can after.
Oh yeah.
Something about boiling the heck out of something for an hour does a good job.
Really takes care of the sanitizing for you.
Right, so we'll see how I go on a level sort of surface. I might even get you if you can.
Yeah, I'll give you a hand. Sorry, I'm doing. I'm
to handle the trivet.
Fiddling some. Yep.
So I can go 2 hands. It's just a little bit safer.
Again, another useful tip if you get someone to help you on brew day. It makes life easier.
And that way we only get a few drips from the back end of the trivet instead of drips everywhere as I'm swinging this around with one hand and trying to swing a trivet under with the other. So that weighs probably about 12 kilos. I didn't end up needing the ladder after that, but because each kilo of grain sucks up about 1 litre of water, so we'll say roughly 12 kilos there. It's not a huge amount, but it's enough that it kind of can become a challenge when you're lifting awkwardly at an awkward angle with one hand and trying to push the trivet under it. So the Brewmasters actually have a built-in lug system, which means that you can do it with one hand. You're not trying to throw a trivet under it. But because of the way that I'm brewing today, I want to be able to get under it with the hops, and I also want to be able to see under it as I'm sparging to get to my volumes. I've elected to use an aftermarket trivet just to give me a little bit more, I don't know what the word is, just to help me see a bit better and just to give me a bit more access to what's going on under it. But you don't actually need a trivet like that with the Brewmaster. It will hold itself up. And I think most of the single vessel systems have similar kind of inbuilt, oh thanks.
Yeah, their own version.
Their own kind of way of keeping the malt pipe elevated.
A hack, I guess you could say that we.
Yeah, I'm choosing to use the trivet for my own nefarious ends.
And I guess this circling back to first we're hopping, so we pulled the pipe out of the machine and so the boil hasn't officially started yet. And it's going to take, so the temperature of the wort is probably sitting.
Thanks for reminding me.
Hot tip. Start cranking the boil as soon as you remove your grains. And this is true. This is true if you're brewing a bag, or I guess if you're a single vessel system user, you know how it works. But yeah, after removing the pipe, then to add the
Get some hops in underneath, and I'll try to stir them around. So that's why I kind of wanted to use the trivet, because having that little bit of extra elevation means I can get the paddle in there and give it a bit more of a stir. Yeah. Also, every time you open a bag of hops, stick your nose in the bag, inhale deeply, and just appreciate that moment, because it is one of the better moments in life. And I've said a number of times since I've been working here that the day I open up a big bag of hops to package and I don't stick my face in it immediately is the day that I quit. Because what's even the point anymore?
If you like every time it's hot packaging day and you walk through the packaging room, it's just play out press hop aroma. That's a perk, definitely a perk. So the reason why this is different, again for any beginners out there, traditionally you would add your hops at the start of the boil. So once your vessel hits 100 degrees, it starts boiling, you put the first amount of hops in and hit your timer, and that's your bitter in charge. But these are going in right now, long before the boil. The temperature of the wort is around 80 degrees Celsius, I believe, and those hops are going to stay in there for the duration of the boil, isn't it? Right?
Yeah, yeah.
And,
so we should still extract the same bitterness from them, maybe a little bit more, but I don't tend to find that I see more bitterness from them.
And logic would tell you that, that boiling hops for this long, you'll extract a lot of grassy notes. You'll lose all your delicate aroma characteristics, and you'll just wind up with not a lot. You're in the boil, but before the boil, something gets locked in, and it's said that what you get is a more delicate. Well, there's something extra.
I'm inclined to agree.
There's something intangible that it adds to the beer. That when you make it, you'll have a beer, whether it's an XPA or an IPA. Doing this extra step adds some magical element.
I think as well, the bitterness you get from it is a better bitterness.
That's what I've heard too.
It's a different bitterness. And I know that, like we were saying before, that this beer is about punchy, intense bitterness. So it seems counterintuitive to do it this way, but you get more of the bitterness this way because it is at isomerization temperature for longer. And I'll go into what that actually means as well in a second for any folks who might be a little bit newer who are watching the stream. Because it is a big word that doesn't make a lot of sense if you're not across the lingo.
Yeah.
But you're at bitterness extraction temperatures for a longer period of time, so you do extract more bitterness as a result of that. But it's a different quality of bitterness, and I think you can get away with packing more IBUs into your beer doing it that way. So this is just cold water. It's a good idea regardless of which system you're using, normally to use hot water for your sparge. I'm effectively putting 20% of the volume of the kettle back in the form of the sparge in this system. So I have 20 litres in there. I'm putting in about 5 or 6 litres to bring it up to 25. And because this water's cold, it's going to drop the temperature of the liquid in the kettle by quite a bit, which is going to take more energy to then, and time, to then bring it back up to the temperature that I'm shooting for the boil. It also, theoretically, it should do a better job of rinsing sugar off the grains at a warmer temperature. But they've done a few studies that show that cold sparging and warm sparging don't really have much of an impact on efficiency. So apparently not.
Okay, yeah, interesting.
But
it does make a longer boil.
It makes for a little bit longer to get to your boil.
Day.
And you'll need to use more energy to get the liquid to that temperature as well. Because you're losing the heat that's already been put in there by adding the cold water in. But, you know, I'm measuring 6 litres. I'm gonna add that and then I'll probably just leave it at that. I'll watch sort of what's going on under there, and once it hits it's getting kind of close to the point actually. I might even just leave it at 5 litres.
I hope everyone can hear me now. I might cut out there for a sec. I think I'm back.
It's approaching the 25 litre mark in there, so I'll leave it at 5 litres and see if it gets there, and if I need to add a little bit more, I always can. I've got the kettle underneath ramping to the boil, so I don't have to worry about I can just leave this sitting here draining. I'm in no rush to get it off. So I can just leave that sitting there, and then if it's been sitting there a while, it still hasn't hit the thing, I can just put more water through. It's not a big deal. We'll see how we go. And what you can do as well is you can just add the water to the kettle to get to your volume. I always figure if you're going to be adding more water in, you may as well add it in through the grain to get a little bit more of that awesome sugar out of there, but it's not essential. What you probably find as well, depending on your system, the brown masters are really efficient. Pretty consistently get in the kind of 75 to 80% like brewhouse efficiency, which is basically of the potential sugar that you could extract from the grains. It's getting, like, under perfect lab conditions, it's getting sort of 75 to 80% of that sugar extracted, which is pretty standard. Lots of people say, oh, you know, you want to get 90% at least, and it's, you know.
Yeah, no, it depends on what your efficiency. Yeah, it's one of those things. It depends on what you're chasing. If you're chasing numbers, if you're a pro brewer, if you're a professional brewer, then yeah, you want to.
Well, we do get from the big brown masters, so we do double mashing. We do get over 90% fairly regularly.
Yeah, that's pretty good.
You can definitely squeeze it out of the system if you want to, but I don't know that it's really necessary.
Yeah. Flavour, I would. Flavour and efficiency don't necessarily correlate.
Exactly.
So, yeah, chase flavour, not efficiency, not sugar.
You can also sort of hit, like I could just keep rinsing water through this until I got every last bit of sugar out of that grain and hit 100% efficiency, you know? But I'd have such a weak, terrible wort underneath it. Would have all that astringency I was talking about not wanting earlier. Because once you start sparging past a certain gravity, so that is the liquid coming off from underneath the grains is below a certain gravity, you start pulling tannins and things from the husks,
Yep,
and that's when
undesirable.
you start introducing astringency as well.
Yeah.
So you don't want to really dip below kind of 1010, so 1.01 specific gravity as you run off.
Yep.
Once you get below that, you kind of
It's a sign you're pulling out.
you're getting stuff
into your
don't want.
beer that you don't want. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yes. And that was something a mistake I made as a new brewer, I think, was chasing efficiency, chasing the numbers. I wanted to get as much efficiency. I was 85, 90%. If I didn't get about 85%, I wasn't happy, and I'd failed. But I wasn't thinking about, well, what does that actually mean? And chasing that number on my system at the time was just so much, there was so much more effort. And I've become a lazier brewer as I've gone on. The more I brew, the lazier I get. So efficiency, as long as I'm hitting 75% is enough for me. And if that means I have to add more grain to hit that number, I'm fine with that because more grain equals more flavour.
I prefer consistent efficiency over ever increasing efficiency.
Yeah. So find a number that you're happy with, and
if I know that my system's going to be at a set level of efficiency every time I use it, then that means I can eyeball things. I can kind of. It got to the point with my first brew system where I hardly had to measure anything. I just knew what was going to happen based on using it enough times. I knew how my system worked. I knew the kind of things I could expect from it, and I would measure anyway, and I would consistently find that I was exactly where I thought I was going to be, because you get to know the system that you're working with, and you form this kind of intuitive sort of knowledge of it.
Yeah.
And the more you brew on a piece of kit, the more you kind of just get to know it.
and every system is different, and it just makes for an easier brew day if you're not having fun. And that was my problem, is I wasn't having fun brewing anymore because I was obsessing over these targets and numbers and not just thinking about the process and what is it about this I enjoy. And since then, I made some changes to my procedure, and on my system, I'll tend to I won't sparge anymore. I'll do a full volume, no sparge. That usually means my efficiency is lower, but I'll add more malt. I'll add a bit of extra malt to compensate for that. I know on my system how much, what my efficiency is. Again, it's about 75%. And that's repeatable and doable, and I'm happy with the results that brings. So
Repeatable is really the big one. I think for me, a sign that I'm getting better as a brewer is repeatability.
Yeah.
Like the more consistent my brewing is, the more I'm able to recreate things based on taking proper notes, taking proper measurements, being across what's happening more. The happier I am, and the more I see that as a sign of progress. Minimizing different variables is a great way to achieve efficiency, and one of those variables can be your brewhouse efficiency. So did I say? I think I used efficiency wrong in that sentence too many times. One of the ways to measure that progress is minimizing variables, and efficiency is a variable. So if you can lock that in, get that consistent, then it's one less thing that's changing each time that could potentially shift the end result into different places.
Yes. I think you all understood
Yeah.
what we were getting at there. No, I wasn't having a dig at you.
I'm actually going to start pushing down on the mash.
So you're squeezing the mash.
I'm squeezing the bag.
The mash. Don't squeeze the
Squeezing
bag, Ben.
guys. Don't squeeze the bag.
So,
You just squeeze the bag. Do whatever it takes to get the liquid out of there. There's like one of those sort of homebrew kind of old brewer's tales, I guess, for lack of a better term.
Yeah, and there's a lot of those around. Yeah.
People sort of saying if you squeeze the bag in brewing a bag, you're going to squeeze all the tannins out of the grain. You're going to get astringent beer. It's going to be undrinkable. And there's multiple breweries in Australia that use a hydraulic mash press, which like basically has a machine that squeezes the mash to get every last bit of liquid out of it. And they hit like 115, 120% efficiency.
Yikes.
And
I bet their beers are terrible.
Yeah,
They're
their
terrible,
beers are so
tannic.
astringent, guys.
Must be
They're
terrible.
They're not at all. They're delicious beers.
Yep.
So unless your hands have extreme power,
Yeah.
that
If you're one of those people who can like fold and ironing,
just figure out exactly the way to fold the tower to wring the last drop of water.
Or rip a phone book in half. Maybe you can extract enough. But yeah, it is. It's one of those. What was one of those early criticisms of brew in a bag was that somehow, the process of squeezing the bag, you would extract tannins and nasty stuff. But it was one of those assumptions that was not based on anything. It was a theory. And since brew in a bag has been popularly practiced by, I would say, maybe thousands of brewers worldwide.
Oh yeah. Well, Denny and Drew are doing it now.
Oh really? Oh geez.
Yeah.
That there you go.
They were late adopters, but enthusiastic ones.
Okay. Well, if they're doing it,
when they came out in
the results are in.
The last ANHC conference we had, which was meant to be one this year, but
something happened.
Something happened. I don't know what. But
so
we couldn't get a whole bunch of people from all over the country in a room and the world in a room together to drink beers this year for some reason.
Yeah, we're not allowed. But yeah, Denny Conn and Drew Beecham, we're talking about some other personalities in the home brewing world. Recommend you check them out. But yeah, squeezing the bag, just a final squeeze away is the consensus on that. Don't believe what you hear. Squeeze the bag as hard as you like, because pro brewers are using a hydraulic press to get as much sugar out of the bag as possible, and they're fine. So I think as home brewers,
you never know when you're going to lose your bag. So take the time to squeeze it when you've got the chance.
Yeah, good tip for everyone. Sage advice.
I think with so many of those things, I've always kind of taken the approach that I'll do the thing which is going to yield me the result that I want, and then if something bad happens from me doing the thing, I'll stop doing the thing. I feel like that's a good, because I mean, yeah, exactly, it's a good way to learn. Like, if something bad does happen, you can say, oh, okay, so I've scientifically, at least for me, like I've shown empirically that this happens, or anecdotally, I don't know. Yeah. I'm not a scientist. I'm using the words wrong. I apologize. Tell me off in chat. Leave a comment on the videos, like saying, who is this guy? Why is he talking like that? But yeah,
so squeeze your bags.
I want to find things out for myself. It's that wet paint thing, right? Like, you're not inclined to touch a wall until you see a sign on it that says wet paint, because you just have to make sure for yourself.
And that's right. A lot of the stuff floating around in here. A lot of the advice on the internet is not all advice is equal, and we've made this point on the show before. So sometimes it's good just to make your own mind up about certain things and try. Squeezing.
Well, I guess as we discussed earlier as well, people have different flavour thresholds and tolerances for different things. So I don't know. Maybe you've got amazing strength and you're squeezing tannins out of that bag, but maybe you don't notice the tannins and you're happy with the beer. So you're getting more beer out of the bag. Keep doing it.
Yeah. Squeeze your bag, people. Squeeze your bags.
I'm going to grab a sieve, because when I was slopping around the grain earlier in the mash, I did get a little bit of grain outside of the malt pipe. I'm just going to see if I can scoop some of that up.
All right.
Not that one. Should be over here somewhere.
Sorry,
maybe I won't.
Tuned out there.
Maybe I won't get a sieve. No sieving today.
Let's just put some behind the scenes footage there.
It's over here. That's what I was chasing.
What do we got there?
It's just a sieve. So I'm going to get it in there and scoop out some chunks of grain that made it out of the malt pipe in the mash. Because if I can get them out of there before it starts boiling, that is a way to get astringency into your beers, is boiling the actual husks of the grain. Which is why we remove the mash, or why we sort of separate the liquid from the grain during the brewing process. So we don't want to boil all those sort of tannins out.
Speaking of tannins, yep.
You know what? I think I'm just going to leave them in there because I'm getting heaps of hops in the sieve. And I want those hops in there. So you can see I'm getting like green hop matter in there. It's more important to me that I have the hops in there than it is that I get those few little chunks of grain out. So we'll just brew it with the grain. It's not enough to really be a huge problem, but
yeah, sure. I guess it's one of those things that with the extra little bit of effort, that can't hurt.
Yeah, and it's also, I think, I'm a fidgeter.
Ah, yes.
And beer is one of those things that tends to be very much a hands-off thing for the most of it. Like, there's a lot of standing around waiting. Like, you put some things in there and then you wait, and then you put some more things in there and you wait, and you do a little thing over here and then you wait. I like to get in there and be doing things. I'm a stirrer through the mash, quite like when I'm brewing at home. And then when you've got the grains out, I like to get a thing and scoop it. When the protein, like the hop break starts to happen, I like to get in there and scoop some of the scum off. Like, I just like to feel like I'm helping.
Yeah,
like I'm doing stuff.
Yeah, it's funny, like a lot of these things, I'm not a serial skimmer. Sometimes I will and sometimes I won't. But you know, if it makes you feel like you're doing something.
I think that's literally all it is. It's just like, oh yeah, I'm helping, I'm taking part. We are, however, at the 25 litre mark, which is why I pulled the grains off. I'm going to give it a quick stir. Try to get stuff up from the bottom, because what can happen at this point is that the sugars can kind of stratify and settle out to the bottom before the boil starts. So when the boil starts, you've got that movement, that sort of kinetic energy.
Oh yeah, okay.
Mixes everything together. It's not as bad with the Brewmeister because there's a pump that runs up until I think 90 something degrees. So the pump is kind of moving things around and keeping it pretty well mixed.
Yeah.
But
in your, say, if you've got a burner, an outdoor LPG burner or something, you'll want to keep it just stirring it while it's coming up to the boil?
More just, I'm giving it a mix because I'm about to grab a refractometer
of course.
and take
Okay,
a
got
gravity
it
reading.
for your
So I just want to make sure that the sugar's mixed evenly through it so that I'm getting an accurate reading. And then when I make my calculations, I'm making them based on a real figure, not kind of...
Yeah, I think you said that. I probably
wasn't paying attention. I don't think I'd quite gotten there yet. So that is the thing that I mentioned earlier that I forgot this morning, so I'll be right back.
That we didn't do. Just chat amongst yourselves.
Cool. So this handy dandy little gizmo is a refractometer. So you can probably guess from the name what it does. It measures the refractive index of whatever liquid you put.
That's exactly what I was going to say.
In the window. So the more sugar that you have in a liquid, the more light is refracted by that liquid. And there's a little scale in the window, and there's the piece of glass here is blue, and the scale is written on not blue. So what happens is as the light shines through the liquid and through the blue, it projects the blue line onto the scale. So if there's no sugar in the liquid, it's calibrated to distilled water.
Mm-hmm.
If there's no sugar in the liquid, if it's like a 1.000 specific gravity, you just see a completely blue scale. It shines straight through. As the liquid gets thicker and more refractive, it bends the light that hits it, and that blue light that's coming through the little blue lens moves up the scale to a different point. So what we're effectively measuring is how thick and how much dissolved solids are in that liquid by how much it bends light as it passes through. So it's not quite as accurate as a hydrometer, So
Yeah,
hydrometers
okay, yeah.
measure density based on how high the device floats in the liquid. But because you only need a drop, or like a few drops, it is temperature calibrated, but a few drops cools down significantly faster than the 100 or so mils you need to take a hydrometer reading. So you can take measurements on the fly whilst you're sort of brewing, whilst you're dealing with hot liquid, and get an idea pretty quickly where you're sitting so you can make adjustments, make calculations, do all those sorts of things. So a very handy tool to have as an all-grain brewer.
Yep, sure. Yep.
You can use them for fermentation, but alcohol has a different refractive index and it throws off the readings. So if you're using it to measure fermenting liquid, you need to add a few extra, that you can find like correction calculators, which you need a few numbers to input into those to get the correction, to find out what it really is measuring at. So if you don't know what your starting gravity is, your correction won't work.
Won't work, yep. So you've got to know your starting gravity, and I believe Brewer's Friend has a calculator corrector, refractometer corrector thingy,
It does
or
indeed.
you could just use, I tend to rely on not refractometers, hydrometers post-fermentation.
You can't tell under my mask, but I've got a big smile on my face.
Okay. I think we can see it in your eyes. Can we?
Exactly where I was hoping to be,
good.
pre-boil. So I'm shooting for 1067 was the recipe that I wrote, because it sort of said somewhere between 1065 and 1070.
Yeah.
I'm currently sitting on 1062 and a half.
Okay.
So I'll boil off probably 3 to 4 litres to evaporation in the boil.
Yep.
And that's going to make the concentration of the liquid go up. So I should end up, I usually see about a 4 or 5 point increase over the boil, usually. So I should end up pretty much exactly where I was shooting for. So
it's always a good feeling.
Everything went according to plan today. I have brewed on the Brewmaster a lot though. So like I was sort of mentioning before, you get to kind of know the system, and you can make educated guesses as to how things are going to turn out. And that's kind of what's happened today. But if it wasn't according to plan, and if I found out that we were coming in a lot heavier than I was shooting for, I might have decided, sorry, I'll just put this over here. I might have decided to do some dilution, which would generally involve, so the reason why I made sure it was full up to the 25 litre mark beforehand is that with the 2 data points of your gravity and your volume, you can calculate how much sugar is actually in the kettle. So if you know you've got 25 litres at 1062, that's an exact measurement of X amount of sugar. So from that, and I am going to pull out my handy phone, because I have the formulas written down, because my memory is not the best. And if I've got it in front of me, I know I'm going to explain it to you the right way so that you're not...
And actually, while you're doing that, I'll just...
wrong. So it's probably not the best, best form to have a phone out on stream, but let us go.
He's checking his Insta.
Where is it? Where is it? Where is it? Got so many notes written on this phone. There we go. I used to have an app on my phone that Brewer's Friend made a long time ago. And every phone that I upgraded, I would carry it across. And then for whatever reason, the last upgrade, it didn't carry across. And they don't make it anymore. And it makes me sad because it has so many awesome calculators on it. But this particular calculation is a really simple formula. So you want your current volume multiplied by your current gravity divided by your target gravity is how you figure out what your end volume needs to be in order to hit your numbers. And again, talking about consistency, that's what you're trying to do. You need to hit that gravity number in order to get a consistent result from your brewing. So the way to think about it, and it doesn't matter which scale you're using,
Okay.
whether you're using milliliters, liters, pints,
Okay, well, yep.
barrels, whatever.
Hogsheads, yes.
As long as the units are consistent.
Okay, as long as you're in the same.
So you could do your
Scale.
current volume in thimbles times your current gravity in bricks,
Yeah, right.
and you'd still get the same result.
Okay.
So let us take the last 2 digits of our gravity, so 62.
Okay.
And that becomes the gravity units that we're using. So we have 25 litres at 62, so 25 times 62. Do you have a calculator? I'm using my phone.
That had a
hang
calculator
on, I'll pull it
I
up.
can do it.
I'll pull it up.
I can.
Didn't think that one through. Where are we? Calculator. So
If any maths
I know the
geniuses
formula
are
now,
out
so
there.
I don't need it to be up. So 25 times 62 equals 1,550. And I'm going to divide that by 67, which means that the final volume that I want will be 23.13 litres.
Okay.
And I know from experience this will boil off 2 to 3 litres. So that will get me pretty much exactly in the right spot.
Yep. 2 to 3 litres over the hour. Yep. Yep.
So we should finish up with a beer at about 1067.
So you'll hit your target. Yep.
If that number had have been 25 litres, I'll just add more water to it. Another thing that is worth thinking about with that is that, and it's a good time to go into IBUs and hops and isomerized alpha acids and all those things, which I think are kind of important when you're talking about IPAs. IBUs, which is a number that most beer nerds will be familiar with because you see it printed on pretty much every beer, is international bitterness units, and it's an exact measurement of the total number of isomerized alpha acids in a measured volume of liquid.
Yep.
That was a word salad.
Yeah.
But if your end volume of your boil is going to be higher than what you calculated your recipe to, you're going to need to adjust your hop additions to factor that in. So if you're shooting for a if you're expecting a 23 litre in your kettle at the end of your boil, and you've done your bitterness calculations from that, ending it with 25 litres means that you're going to have lower IBUs because it's a measurement of the isomerized alpha acids in a measured volume. So you're going to need to jump on a quick calculator, figure out what adjustment you need to make to your hop additions to hit those numbers. That's if you're trying to hit the numbers exactly. If it doesn't really matter, it doesn't really matter. Today, I'm not.
You can afford to be loosey-goosey. A few IBUs between friends is maybe
and a lot of breweries now are doing everything based on grams per litre rather
that's true. I did notice that.
Rather than IBUs itself. So they may not calculate to IBUs, but they'll still calculate to grams per litre. So
still a measurement.
If their brew length is changing, then their grams per litre changes. And that's how they adjust the recipe that way. And it's the same end result. Like you're still needing to adjust the hoppage to account for the change in volume. And again, this is if you want consistency.
So this goes back to your point about consistency and how, if you're something as simple as your volume, if that is out off target significantly, a few litres maybe not a big deal, but if your efficiency is maybe not what you're expecting, and therefore that affects your final volume is going to be, say, you're going to have to be lower than what you're expecting. You have to boil off more. You're going to wind up potentially with a really bitter beer in that example, because you're going to have less liquid and more hops in that smaller space. So you're going to have to make adjustments on the fly, and it can really throw things out on brew day.
Having things handy that you can make adjustments to. So when we're making the work kits, we operate off a spreadsheet which Chris has put together. And a part of that brew day is we take 3 or 4 different gravity readings before the boil, so that we're getting like it's not just relying on one reading.
All right, you're getting a few data points.
We're getting a few data points, and then we can kind of say, well, they're all reading pretty much this, or,
Yeah.
or like these three are reading this, and this one's the outlier. So we can kind of say we're saying it's this
Yeah.
gravity, and then we will go to the spreadsheet and input those points at the efficiency that we've hit, and figure out what our end volume needs to be. And that will automatically update the hop additions and tell us how much the hops need to go in at different times. And then is when we weigh out our hops ready for the boil, based on that end volume, so that the work hits. When we make a Yarraville Pale Ale, it's going to be Yarraville Pale Ale.
Same Yarraville Pale Ale.
That said,
every
we're
time.
constantly changing them because it's based on hop
Ingredients
availability
changes,
and
yeah.
things like that. So
Yeah.
if we can't get a certain hop, we'll just put a similar hop or a different hop in, and things like that. We're pretty loose with it, but we are pretty consistent in terms of like, they're always going to be the same gravity,
Yep.
and they're always going to be pretty much the same bitterness.
Yep.
The only thing that will change is the flavours based on the hops that we're using.
Depending on what we can get. Yeah, and so as a commercial enterprise, if you're a commercial brewery or a homebrew shop, consistency is important. As a home brewer, it's important more so just for, just makes your life a bit easier, you know, is one consideration. And also just, yeah, it might help you to brew better beer consistently. But if you're out by a few points here or there, or half a litre here or there too, it just comes down to how, I suppose, how far you want to go to take that, you know, how much of that extra mile you want to take to be that, you know, how consistent you want to be is up to you.
A good trick as well is if you're trying to brew a certain style of beer and you want to get within the parameters, shoot for right in the middle of the range, because that gives you usually a few gravity points and like a good sort of 10 or 15 IBUs leeway. So if you end up coming in under, you can still be hitting the right numbers, or if you come in a little over, you still be hitting the right numbers.
Yeah.
It gives you like a bit of a buffer zone.
Yeah, that's it. That's a good tip.
Which kind of accounts for variance and things.
Yeah.
Because even like, we get wildly different results each time we brew on these big systems, just because we're using so much more grain.
Yeah.
The grain is going to behave differently. Like one sack of grain to the other sack of grain, you're going to get different extraction rates, you're going to get different like results from it, even in the exact same conditions.
Yeah, stuff happens on brew day. That
Things like humidity can affect stuff. Like all these different factors
Small
can come
factors,
into play. So, yeah.
So yeah, okay, good.
But I think it's a good time to start talking about what an alpha acid is, and what is the difference between an isomerized alpha acid and a non-isomerized alpha acid. Because we've mentioned it a few times, and not everyone will necessarily know. If you do know, awesome. But I think it's still worth sort of touching on. So basically, hops have a number of things in them that make them smell and taste really nice. They also have a number of things in them which make them bitter. And probably the main thing which we associate with hop bitterness is alpha acids. They're always there, but they're not always soluble. So if you just put hops into a beer, so dry hopping is a great example of this. You can throw dry hops into a beer and they'll impart lots of flavour and aroma. They'll impart a little bit of bitterness, but they'll mostly impart flavour and aroma. And those alpha acids, which are sort of the main contributor of bitterness in all these different beers, won't stay in solution. They'll settle out and they won't carry across into the end beer. So in order to make them soluble, in order to make them dissolve into the beer so that they stick around, you need to boil them. The longer you boil them for, or the longer you hold them above, I think 80 degrees is the temperature roughly at which they start isomerizing. So the longer you hold them in that temperature range, and the higher that temperature is, the more of those alpha acids are going to isomerize and stay in the beer. It's telling me to remove the lid. Well, joke's on you, machine. There is no lid. What was I saying? Yeah. So basically, you'll often hear about people using terms like bittering hops or flavor hops or aroma hops, or like they'll apply different like adjectives or like prefixes
Yeah.
to the hops. And what they're basically implying with that is your bittering hops are going to go in generally at the start of the boil. And that's where the majority of the bitterness for that beer is going to come from. Not always, not necessarily, but generally speaking. And the reason why sorry, we've got we've got a bit of playback happening in the background. Sorry, I'll just
Stuart, sorry, yeah, everyone.
We can hear. Just
You're good to see us go through. It's all right. It's all good.
So the majority of your bitterness is going to be coming from those early boil hops, because you're going to be boiling them at or around 100 degrees for about an hour.
Yeah.
And that's going to extract most of the bitterness out of those hops. Your flavour hops are going to be boiled for a shorter period of time, and a lot of those flavour and aroma compounds are more volatile. So the boiling process is going to kick a lot of them off into the atmosphere. Your garage will smell amazing, but a lot of that is lost from the beer.
Yeah.
Not as much as they used to think, though. We've done a few kind of beers here which have, with time, definite flavours of the bittering hop that was used have come up and presented themselves.
I think that, I mean, I don't think it's a black and white thing that, it has been said that your bittering hops, if you just did a single addition, say 60-minute addition, and all you're doing is bittering, that you'll lose all flavour and aroma. All you'll get is bitterness. I don't think that's necessarily true. I think as a rule, you still get some. It depends on the hop, I think, and a lot of other factors, but you'll still get a bit of flavour and aroma carry through from that bittering addition. It may be subtle, but I feel like it'll be there. But people disagree with me if you like. Feel free to.
We have hit the ball.
If anyone has it, yeah.
I'm just doing a few adjustments.
Yeah, no, Ben's doing a thing. So yeah, if anyone has any thoughts on that too, pop your comments in the chat or the comments section. What do you think? Do you lose all flavour and aroma from a bittering addition, or do you find that some carries through? I
reckon aroma maybe, but definitely flavour kicks around. And one of the ways that we found that out was we did it was one of the Lefty Juicy Wort kits, which has Simcoe is in it, but only as a bittering hop. And because we were going through, when we had the wall of beer running, we were going through so much of that beer that Maddie decided to make, I think, like 2 60-litre fermenters of it at once, so that we had like 5 or 6 kegs full of it ready to just swap out on the wall.
Yeah.
And by the last one, it was starting to get on a little bit, and it had lost a lot of the kind of the front hops.
All the dry
But what
stuff.
had happened was, as they'd sort of, and it wasn't completely lost, but it had just lost a bit of it. And as they'd receded, that black currant flavour started rising up.
That cat weed.
And we knew that that was coming, because the other hops we'd used didn't have that. So we knew that was coming from the Simcoe, and that was the bittering hop, which supposedly you boiled it for an hour, there should be nothing left of it, but it was still absolutely present. So I think the hop you use as your 60-minute addition, if you're doing a 60-minute addition hop, definitely does have an impact on the flavour of the beer. So it is worth considering and worth thinking about.
I agree.
But yeah, so your IBUs are a measure of the total amount of isomerized alpha acids that are suspended in a measured solution of liquid. So that sentence hopefully now makes more sense than it did before.
Isn't it? It's every word is in there for a reason. It's a measured amount of alpha acids in a
set volume. Which, that's why it's so important to be across your volumes and know kind of what you're going to end up with and factor that into your plans. If you're going by IBUs, which a lot of IPAs, no one does that anymore.
Yeah.
Because we've hit the point where, like, I think the supposed flavour threshold for IBUs for human beings is like 100.
That's what it's been said, yeah.
And we're getting beers now that are 150, 200, 300, whatever.
If you measure it, yeah.
You can't tell the difference anyway. So it's just about how many grams per litre of this hop do I need to add to get the flavour that I'm chasing.
Yeah, so yeah, that is a good point. As you said, craft breweries are going on grams per litre now. Do you think IBUs, are IBUs a thing of the past? No? Do IBUs matter anymore? Maybe that's another question.
It depends on the beer, I think.
Yeah.
We very much focus on IBUs with our work kits. And I think part of that is we've got a bunch of different people at different levels of their beer journey coming in and starting up homebrewing. And some people, for some people, homebrewing is this really kind of impassioned pursuit of brewing excellence, which I think, pretty much anyone who works here feels about it that way.
Yeah, agree with.
But for a lot of people, and not at all something to be taken away from them. You do what you do for the reasons you do it.
Yeah.
They just want to have beer at home. Maybe they just want to have a kegerator set up that they can just pour beers from, have friends over and impress them, and just being able to grab a work kit and pour it in there and know what you're going to get is, I think, important in that context. They're not. A lot of those people aren't necessarily big hop heads that are chasing a big explosion of flavour. If you go into a craft beer bar and you order an IPA, there's certain expectations that come with ordering that IPA. If you just like the idea of having beer at home, you come into a homebrew shop and you buy a $50 kit of thing, of Aussie Draft or Fresh Ale or a Yarraville Pale or one of those kind of lower impact beers.
Yes.
You're not expecting to get your head blown off with bitterness. Yeah. And so I think it's really important that we are keeping that in mind of where it's sitting in terms of the bitterness levels.
Yeah, so in those beers you do have to be mindful of your numbers, and
we probably could get away with just blasting it out with the US IPA or something, but I think it's having the consistency in process as well is really important, because regardless of which beer we're brewing, it's the same process, and that consistent process is what ends up carrying across to all the beers and having that consistent flavour and having that
So perhaps we've moved on as craft beer drinkers then from this idea that IBUs equal a good beer, or whatever that idea was that during that arms race of the IBU arms race in the 90s and early noughts.
Yeah.
That number was somehow important, that 200 IBUs or 300 IBUs. Oh, this beer must be awesome because it's got 5 billion IBUs in it. But
I think as well, we've hit a point where we've just all completely blown our palates out to the point that we don't notice it anymore. It's not a consideration for a lot of
it's just not
a lot of people in the beer scene. And the younger crew coming up are going to have to go through that whole thing again. So we'll probably see a cyclical thing of going back to, and NEPAs are a great example. Right now, all the IPAs that you get aren't these big, intensely bitter things. No. And I see a lot of, I'm in a lot of online communities, and I see a lot of sort of Zoomers coming up in them, and they all sort of almost universally say that IPAs are just a bad thing, they just taste bad.
Okay.
And I'm like, what are you talking about? They're delicious. And then I think, but they didn't go through that process of just punishing their taste buds
beating
for 5 or 10 years to get to the point where they just don't notice the...
I guess it's something you got to go through.
Yeah, and it's kind of similar. So I really enjoy chili. And I've sort of found that a lot of the really hot chilies, the really hot chilies, have the best flavour.
Yeah, okay, I've heard that. Yeah.
So even at a kind of slightly more entry level, like a habanero or something, just still nothing to sneeze at, but it's just not in the realm of your Jolokias or your Scorpions and your Reapers, those sorts of things. It's got this pineapple-y, mango-y kind of awesome thing going on with it, but I taste that and get it, whereas my brother-in-law who can't handle chili,
no, I wouldn't be able to do it.
Doesn't even get past the the initial fire. It's just that's all of that is for them. And I remember the first time I drank an IPA was Sierra Nevada Torpedo IPA. And my thoughts were, I may as well have just chewed a big handful of Panadol.
Yeah.
Like, this is horrible.
Yeah.
Why would people order this? And it took me a really long time. Even like, I was working here for a while, like maybe like a good sort of 6 months to a year before I really was fully on board with IPAs, because I just, like, the bitterness just
had to ride that
I couldn't get past it.
train. Yeah. Same for me with sour beers. First sour beer I ever had, I probably dove in a little too deep, and it was a Cantillon, back in the days when you could actually get a bottle of Cantillon in Australia.
Yeah.
And it was like one of those sour warhead lollies that people may remember. That was how I perceived it anyway. Now I look back and I think, what a waste of a perfectly good beer. But I guess it's all interesting points. It'd be interesting to see how things develop as we go forward in the craft beer scene. What happens down the...
You know, what new things are going to pop up as well, because like we mentioned earlier, this whole category of sort of these new world beer styles, like these American pales and IPAs and things like that, is 30, 40 years old.
It's very young, yeah.
So we're already seeing some interesting and weird things popping up. Like, I mean, like the New England IPA is a good example. Like, that's what, 5, 10 years now that they've kind of been a thing.
Yeah,
and
true. That's, and think of it, yeah. So
that's a massive departure from anything that had come before them. And like the idea of having a hazy beer, like the idea of these beers is to have it as clear as you can get it, effectively.
Yeah, that's true. It's so far removed from what was once considered, if you had a hazy beer, it was considered default in an IPA.
You're really playing a balancing act between clarity and hop punch, I think, with this. But like, you know, we went through the pastry stout thing a little while ago.
Yeah. Which I never brewed, but I like the sound of it. I never actually.
And all the fruited lactose beers now that are coming out that are everywhere.
Barrel aging was a big thing, I think, for.
There's all this like innovation and all these like ideas that are getting thrown at the wall, and I don't think that all of them are going to stick.
Sure, no.
Definitely not with the sort of impact that IPA has had, but.
Yes, you'll have a few
really,
stalwarts.
Yeah, it really is an interesting thing. And I think what's interesting as well, again, from just sort of being in a few online spaces with a lot of younger kids, is that so many kids aren't even drinking at all these days.
No, I've heard that, in general.
I don't know what it's like in Australia, but in the States at least, like it's not
alcohol
a
consumption's
thing.
going down.
These 20-somethings, like when I was 20-something, like alcohol
really.
was a very huge cornerstone of my life.
Yeah, in Australia in particular,
But yeah, so many of these sort of 20-somethings are just not interested.
Yep.
I mean, alcohol's so expensive. No one has any money
anymore.
Well,
so that's
kind of like, well, what else can I do to have fun, sort of thing? Like, it's taken a back seat to a lot of other things.
Yeah.
For better or worse.
Yep. Things they be changing. Well, as a style then, IPAs, American IPAs, it's a new style in the grand scheme of things, a young style and perhaps lots of room to grow, and who knows where it'll go. It's just everything's so quickly changing that, too, as well, it seems.
I think as well, like so many of the even older styles that we're all so familiar with now and that we love and drink, like we probably wouldn't even know about them was it not for the IPA, and like the kind of, like I mentioned Fritz Maytag before, like bringing all these old styles back from the dead. And the homebrew scene kind of, the Californian homebrew scene was really where so much of that innovation development happened, that brought all these styles up, and a lot of those homebrewers would go off to start breweries, or the homebrew scene would influence breweries, and like what they were making would end up in those breweries being made commercially, and that still happens.
Yeah, that definitely still happens.
That definitely still happens. Like the homebrewing trends do inform the commercial scene.
Helen's stream a few months back, I think now, about Saison, exactly the same story about a very old style, hundreds of years old even perhaps, that was dead commercially almost, and it was revived by homebrewers.
Wheat beer didn't exist until Hoegaarden started making it again.
Yeah, right.
Heaps and heaps. And you know, for every one of those, there's like 20 styles that just don't exist anymore.
That's true.
And you can look through there's a joy in looking through history books and finding recipes and all those sorts of things. But yeah, it really is sort of like the beer that just kind of drove the revolution and pushed everybody out of their comfort zones and out of those sort of big macro lagers and into like interesting, like the pursuit of more interesting and challenging flavors.
And that's happening across, I think, the consumer world, particularly with food and beverages. People are looking for experiences now and unique things as opposed to what's familiar perhaps and safe as once did. But so do you think, we covered your, I think we went off on a bit of tangent there from your isomerization alpha acids
I think we covered
talk.
it.
You covered,
I think we covered the hops. I did want to talk about, so this is probably the last thing that we really need to talk about with this stuff. We don't have to go all the way through to the ends with these streams. What's basically going to happen is this will boil for an hour. I've got some other hops which I'm going to put in the cube. Just because they're going to hold on to more of that flavour and aroma, and then there'll be a big dry hop at a later point as well. About 4 grams a litre I like to do for these sorts of beers. But I did want to talk about the clarity thing, because we sort of have mentioned it a couple of times. And I think it's a really sort of important part of this style is that sort of toing and like the tug of war between clarity and character. You're trying to see how much hops you can pack into a beer and still have it relatively clear.
Yeah, right. And so you're talking about the visual clarity, are you?
Yeah. So having it in a glass and being able to pretty well see through it.
Yep.
I think that's a real hallmark of the West Coast IPAs.
Definitely, sure.
But it's not clear by Pilsner standards.
Yeah, okay.
Or like Helles standards or anything like that. Like it's not a lager.
Yeah.
But also like, I think a really awesome thing to have with this style is like a slick of hop oil. So like you don't want like head retention is kind of not something to worry about with this sort of beer. You want to cram enough hops in there that the amount of hop oil is in there is going to kill the head anyway.
Yeah, anyway, sure.
But again, going back to Hendo, like because when I started here, he was sort of like the person I looked up to with hoppy beers in the sort of commercial beer scene. So like whenever I've sort of, when he was in here and sort of doing things, I'd kind of take notice, and I was bad at making hoppy beers back then, so took extra notice.
Yep.
But he was doing a brew in the 500 litre Braumeister, I think for one of our System Wars events maybe, or for some kind of event that we were all running, and was making sure to draw attention of everybody in attendance to the thick, slick and runs of shimmering hop oil that was just pooling on the surface of the kettle. And
that's where all the good stuff is.
Oh, it really is
resin and
a good sign that you're on the right track to this sort of beer, I think. Just having that, just that.
There's something satisfying about it.
Luscious, like stinky, sticky hop oil just floating on the beer. And it impacts the texture of the beer in the end as well. Mm-hmm. Like we talked with the NEPAs about how the calcium chloride adds a softness to the texture. And I think also adding to that softness is the fat from the oats.
Yeah.
So oats have a really high fat content, and that fat imparts a softness and a mouthfeel to that beer, makes it kind of more velvety, more sort of slippery. And I think you want a bit of that in a West Coast IPA as well. You want that velvety, not chewy, but you want it to sort of be sparkling, and you want it to kind of be drinkable, but having that slight slickness and kind of velvetiness from the hop oils is a nice thing as well. And it coats your palate with the hops. So I went to New Zealand. I always bring up my New Zealand trip because I had so many amazing beers when I was over there. But I went to New Zealand a few years ago, and I think for me, one of the standout beers of the trip was a brewery called Moa, and it was a triple IPA.
Oh, yeah, okay.
And I had it was like this little, at the top of Lake Taupo, there's like a little beer bar there, and I ended up going there like 2 or 3 times in the week that we were staying around the Lake Taupo region. And they had it on tap, and I got myself a glass of it. It was like 8 or 9% alcohol.
Mm-hmm.
It was so much hops in there, and it had that just coating hoppiness.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it was as clear as you could get for that amount of hops and that higher sort of gravity. Like, it was a thick beer because it's 8 or 9%. It's, again, getting into barley wine territory.
Yes, sure. Yeah. See that? Yeah.
But that coating sort of slickness, and it wasn't a slickness like you get from diacetyl. So diacetyl is an off flavour that you often get in beer for pretty much not pitching enough yeast or halting fermentation before it's
fermentation issue. Yeah.
And the main sort of characteristics of it are a butterscotchy sort of caramelly flavour and a slickness in the mouth. It's a hop killer, diacetyl.
Right. Okay.
So when you end up with diacetyl in the beer, it knocks out the hops a lot.
Yeah, right. Is that does something chemically to knock out the hop?
I don't know
flavour,
exactly how it works.
Right. Okay. Yep.
But yeah, definitely
whatever it
must.
does.
Like when you have diacetyl in a hoppy beer, you lose a lot of the you lose the hops.
You lose the hops. Okay. Yep.
But it's not that sort of slickness. It's a different sort of slickness. It's an oily, hoppy deliciousness, and I've said it 100 times. It just coats your mouth. Like your mouth is coated with hop oil, and you're tasting hops for like the next half hour to an hour. It's an awesome thing. It's a beautiful, beautiful thing. And if you can achieve that, then you're
while
doing
getting
really, really well.
Yeah, sure, a clear beer. Hops.
But you also want it clear.
You still want it clear. So hops. Adding hops will add haze to beers as well. In particular, if you're dry hopping,
the dry hop in particular gets a lot of that happening.
Which I guess if you're adding, West Coast IPAs are hoppy, so you're going to get a certain amount of haze no matter what.
Yeah.
So I guess as you were saying, it's not.
You're playing that balancing act.
It's a balancing act. Yeah.
You're seeing how far you can push it and still getting that clarity in there, and it can be a matter of experimentation.
Right. Findings a good thing or a bad thing, do you think? Because are you going to be
both.
stripping out? Right.
Because you will strip out flavour and character.
Because that's one of the negatives of findings, is that, well, pull your proteins out in your haze compounds, but they might also pull out some of the other things that you want in your beer.
Yeah. And one thing that I'll always say, and particularly, like I've brought up comps a few times here. So most of the crew who works here does judging at like beer comps and stuff. And if you're wanting to get some really good feedback on a beer you've made, I mean, one thing you can do is bring it in here. We'll taste it and we'll assess it and talk you through what we're kind of picking up. But a really great way to keep improving as a brewer, besides joining a brew club, is entering your beers into some comps and getting some feedback from some judges. And if you're entering an IP, you're entering anything into a comp, the score sheets are structured so that the appearance is going to be maximum sort of 3 to 5 points out of your total 50 or 60.
Yep, okay, so it's not a big...
So if you've got a beer that smells and tastes incredible but doesn't look quite right, whatever interventions you're going to attempt to get it looking right are probably going to impact the flavour and the aroma, which are responsible for the bulk of your of your sort of assessment. So if you're trying to get a beer perfect for competition, you're better off leaving it, because if you've got a hazy beer that is the right colour, has the right type of head, you're only going to lose maybe 1 or 2 points of that sort of 5 or 6 point total.
Yeah.
If you're entering an IPA and it's black, then that's different.
You're going to get away with it, perhaps, but don't.
But even then, you're going to lose 5 or 6 points.
Yes. Yeah.
But if it's the right colour, if the head retention's right, and the only issue is the clarity, that's 1 or 2 points.
Yeah. But
it's not.
Perhaps don't run it through a filter. Trying to get it clear for the comp.
Or throw different findings in there to try to all of those things are
'Cause you
going
might
to
lose what
impact
makes-
the other characteristics. So if you're happy with how it smells and tastes, leave it.
Yeah.
And even if you're not entering into a comp, if you're going to end up with 20 litres probably of whatever this beer is, so leave it the way that it smells and tastes the best to you.
Because you're
going to keep wanting to go back to that keg and you're going to drain it, and then the memory of that beer isn't going to be that beer that was really hazy. It was that beer that was really delicious, and I finished the keg really quickly. But yeah, if you're using kettle finings, if you're keeping the grain bill relatively sort of like, you know, we mentioned not using crystal, things like wheat and oats and stuff like that are going to introduce a lot of protein. Maybe avoid that. Making sure that your mash is doing the job it needs to do. So
your pH then and your salts become a factor.
All those things sort of come into play. Then you're going to get pretty much where you need to be.
Certain yeasts will clear up better than others.
Absolutely. And that's something worth saying as well. So the kind of go-to yeast for a lot of American IPAs is the 1056 or the US 05.
Yes, that's what everyone... Yep,
they are different. We've tested it in the shop, and they definitely come through...
they taste different. Yeah, they definitely...
The US 05 is I'm trying to think of positive descriptors.
It's easy. It's easy to use.
Well, no. So like in terms of the flavour characteristics. So the 1056 is really clear. Like you get that distinction between all the different flavours, the different malts you've used, the different hops you use. It presents them clear and crisp. The US 05, it doesn't have its own flavour, but it kind of blurs the lines between all the other flavours a bit more.
Oh, yes. Yeah, no, so I had it the other way around. I was thinking,
okay.
So 05. Sorry, continue.
So, like, if you compared the US 05 to, say, like a, I don't know, a Saison yeast, it's a very clean yeast.
Yep.
Comparing it to the 1056, neither of them are really imparting their own flavour to the beer.
Yep.
Some people say US 05 has like a dustiness to it, but I didn't really get that. But what I did get was it's a blurring of the lines between the different flavours of the ingredients.
Yep.
Whereas a 1056, it's more defined.
Yeah,
the flavours are more defined.
Memory.
Which I like in this sort of beer.
Yeah, it was brighter. I guess again that's a vague description, but that's my memory of it. It was just brighter. Everything was
switched up.
Yeah, sure. Contrast.
Treble switched
Whereas
up.
the hops were just sort of a bit more there, and everything was just a bit crisper and brighter. And the US 05 was a bit duller.
Yeah,
hard to describe.
More homogenous, but that's not necessarily a bad thing.
Not exactly. Yeah.
The way that we ran that test was we had people vote on which one they liked more and which one they thought was which.
Yeah.
And we got pretty much down the middle for which one people preferred.
That's right.
So try both, and whichever one you like more is the one that you should use. Because like everybody who voted and everybody who put it in, more or less half and half liked one versus the other.
It was almost split down the middle. Yeah.
So,
memory.
Yeah. Not disparaging.
Yeah. Not knocking US 05.
I prefer the 1056 personally, but.
Yeah,
that's me.
In general, I mean, it's a big generalisation, but
my understanding is that Russian River uses an English ale strain.
I think Stone as well.
Stone also uses an English ale strain, and Firestone and Walker use an English ale strain.
And 1056 US 05, the Chico strain, which I believe originated.
We good?
Coming back. All right.
All right, awesome.
We're back. Thanks for hanging in
I
there.
don't know what point at which we lost the audio on that, but we were sort of talking about how a lot of the big West Coast breweries use English ale strains in their beers. And personally, and this is something I got from Jeff, I love using Nottingham, Danstar Nottingham in all my hoppy beers. It stays out of the way of the hops, it ferments nice and clean, it ferments super fast, and it drops out really clear. So it does all the things that I kind of want from that sort of beer. And I find that it leaves the malt, how am I trying to describe it? It leaves the malt present in a way that doesn't make it overpower.
Yeah, okay.
I find with a lot of the American strains, I mean there's only 3 or 4, but I find with the American strains that the malt kind of just disappears.
Yeah,
and I don't love that. Like, I want it to be about the hops, and you know, like I like using a lighter grain build for that reason as well. But I want there to still be like a sort of cereally, biscuity kind of subtle malt flavour there. And I find that the English strains are much better at doing that. And certain strains are better than others. I've heard that the Scottish ale yeast is really good for hoppy beers as well.
Yeah, I've heard that too.
A few people who I respect sort of use that as their house strain that they just put in everything.
I've done that before, and I can't remember.
And my understanding is that Noddy and the Scottish ale are kind of like the liquid and dry equivalents of each other, so that kind of makes sense as well. But yeah, I just really like the character I get from Noddy, and because of dry yeast, it's really easy. You just throw a few packets into the fermenter and away you go.
Okay. So bit of a tip there. Consider using English strains in your American IPAs.
Or playing with it.
Playing with it.
I did an IPA a little while ago, and I had a Mangrove Jack's high gravity American ale yeast in my fridge that I got, I think, from ANHC. And I thought, I'll throw that in there and see how that goes. And it didn't. So I had like a week and nothing had happened. The gravity hadn't dropped at all. I panicked, and all I had in the house was some T58, which is a Belgian dry yeast strain.
Oh yeah.
So I just threw that in there and crossed my fingers and hoped, and it fermented through. And Belgian IPA, like black IPA, was a style that I'd never liked.
Yeah.
But that beer was one of my favourite beers I've made that year. It just had this really nice kind of fruitiness from the Belgian yeast, like banana-y kind of characters with the fruitiness of the hops, and it just worked. So play around.
Yeah.
Use different yeasts, use different ingredients, and always kind of don't be afraid to try something. If it doesn't work out, it's not the end of the world.
Yep.
A batch of beer generally from $30 to $50 tops.
What's the worst?
I've thrown a lot more money than that away on projects that I've stuffed up. So.
Yeah. and you might, as you said, stumble across something delicious.
Yeah, I'll probably make that again one day. That was really nice.
Cool. So, what do you think?
Yeah, I reckon we'll probably call that a stream.
Big chunk of info there. So just the rest of the boil will happen. The recipe I'll post in the description below later today. I'll get that up. There you go. You can take a screenshot of that. Oh,
probably completely out of focus, but
here we go. Yep. But yeah, I will. I'll post a JPEG or a PDF of that. For those of you who want the specifics, otherwise, if any of you out there want to learn how to brew, you can check out our Brew in a Bag video, which is on our website. And it's going to get focused again.
I love that we did an episode, a stream about West Coast IPA, and didn't even mention what hops I was using once. I think it doesn't really matter, I don't think.
Yeah. Excuse me. There we go.
As long as you use lots of them.
Whatever it is, just use a lot. Yeah, and New World hops. Maybe look into what New World means and what those hops are. But anything fruity and is typically
Australia, New Zealand,
Australian. A lot of Australian new hops on the scene, and New Zealand, and of course American. And yeah, the boy will finish up with a no-chill cube. Everything will be chucked in there. We also have a video on that on our channel. You can find that just by searching on our channel page there. So I think yeah, we'll call that a stream. I hope everyone learned something today and enjoyed it. Thanks for all the comments that came through. Stuart is there. He's just wrapping up. He's saying he accidentally brewed a Belgian yeast in the US IPA fresh wort kit, and it came out okay. So yeah, that's.
I'd have a crack at that.
Yeah.
After that experience of just out of desperation using it, yeah, I'd probably have a crack at that for sure.
Never was a big fan of the Belgian IPAs itself either, but I think it's maybe brewing one yourself and having a bit of control is something you could.
Well,
really
yeah, when I heard
well
Belgian IPA as a style, like I had a picture in my head, and then none of the ones that I ever drank had fulfilled that. Like it met that sort of standard, and then that kind of accidental one just nailed it. Like the fruitiness of the hops with the fruitiness of the yeast working together.
I could see on paper how that should work. Yeah. Cool. All right, everyone. Well, we're going to call it a day, and leave you to get on with your lives. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.